At 65, my wife left me for my best friend. She looked me dead in the eye and said he has more money than you will ever have in your entire miserable life. 5 years later, they were planning a $500,000 wedding. They thought they had destroyed me and my kids. They had no idea my children and I had quietly built a $250 million empire right under their noses. Before I tell you how I turned their lavish wedding into the ultimate financial execution, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. My name is Edwin. I am 70 years old, and I am a man who has learned the hard way that silence is often your most lethal weapon. Growing up in the tough neighborhoods of Atlanta taught me resilience, but nothing prepared me for the betrayal of my own family. It was a dreary Tuesday morning. The rain was beating heavily against the large glass windows of a modest diner where I sat in my usual corner booth. I was wearing my favorite faded brown jacket, quietly sipping a cup of black coffee and working on a crossword puzzle. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply, but I did not bother to look up until a heavy gold-foiled envelope was slammed directly onto my table, covering my newspaper. I slowly raised my eyes. Standing over me was Valerie, my ex-wife. She was draped in a designer trench coat that easily cost more than the reliable old car I had parked outside. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she looked down at me with that familiar, piercing expression of absolute disdain that I had endured for decades. She let out a dry, mocking laugh, shaking her head as she eyed my worn-out jacket. Still wearing that pathetic old rag I see, she sneered, her voice carrying across the quiet diner. Some things never change. You are exactly where I left you 5 years ago. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I simply took another slow sip of my coffee and looked at the shiny envelope on the table. "What is this, Valerie?" I asked. "An invitation," she said, her voice dripping with venomous pride. "Mitchell and I are getting married next month. A real wedding, Edwin. The kind of wedding a woman actually deserves, not the cheap backyard barbecue we had 40 years ago." Hearing Mitchell's name did not make my hands shake, even though he used to be my closest and most trusted friend. 5 years ago, when I was 65, Valerie walked into our living room, packed her expensive bags, and coldly told me she was leaving me for him. She said I was a man with no ambition, a man who would die with nothing but a modest pension and a completely boring life. She demanded half of our life savings, maliciously draining the accounts we had built over decades of hard work. She thought her betrayal would completely break my spirit. She expected me to shout, to cry, to beg her on my knees to stay. Instead, I had just silently signed the divorce papers and watched her drive away with the man I once trusted like a brother. Now she was standing in front of me, shamelessly boasting about the lavish life Mitchell was providing for her. "He treats me like a queen," she gloated, tapping her manicured fingers on the wooden table. "He is a real businessman, Edwin. He makes moves. He takes risks. He has given me the entire world. You should see the ring he bought me. It is worth more than this entire diner." I remained completely stoic. I learned a long time ago that silence is the best shield against people who feed on your emotional reactions. I looked at the gold-foiled invitation resting on the table. It was thick, ostentatious, and utterly ridiculous, much like the man she was marrying. "I am happy for you, Valerie," I said evenly, "but I am not sure why you felt the need to deliver this in person. I am not going to attend your wedding." "Oh, I know you are not coming." She laughed, a cold, calculating sound that grated on my nerves. "You could never afford a suit nice enough to pass the dress code anyway. But I did not come here just to drop off an invitation, Edwin. I came here to give you a reality check." She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder, dropping it onto the table right next to the invitation. The smirk on her face grew wider, turning into something truly malicious. "Mitchell is expanding his real estate portfolio," she announced proudly. "He has been buying up commercial properties all over the city. And guess what he just acquired yesterday? The old brick building on 4th Street. My heart kept a steady rhythm, even though I knew exactly what building she was talking about. It was the rundown commercial space where Dominic, our son, had set up his tech company. Valerie leaned in closer, resting her hands on the table, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "That is right, Edwin. Mitchell now owns the building where Dominic runs that pathetic little startup of his. What does he even do in there? Fix broken computers? Sell old phones? It does not matter. Mitchell wants to renovate the space into luxury lofts. The truth was, Dominic was the technical director of a massive logistics software enterprise we had secretly built together over the last 5 years, but Valerie still thought he was running a struggling repair shop because we deliberately kept our massive wealth completely hidden from her. I kept my expression completely blank, revealing absolutely nothing of the multi-million-dollar reality we actually lived in. Valerie mistook my silence for fear. She thrived on the twisted idea that she had finally backed me into a corner. We both know Dominic is barely scraping by. She continued, her voice dripping with fake pity. He has always been a major disappointment, just like his father. No drive, no real ambition. It is sad, really. He is completely in over his head, playing businessman in a dump of a building. I slowly folded my newspaper, placed it to the side, and looked her dead in the eye. Dominic is doing just fine, Valerie. You do not need to worry about him. She laughed loudly, drawing the attention of a few other patrons in the diner. Oh, I am not worried about him, Edwin. I am just delivering the news. Mitchell is the landlord now. She tapped her long fingernail against the manila folder on the table. That is a 30-day eviction notice, she said, her smile turning completely ruthless. 30 days, Edwin. Then Dominic and his little tech hobby are thrown out on the street. Mitchell is going to gut the entire place. I looked at the folder, then back up at the woman I had spent decades of my life with. She was enjoying this, relishing the power she thought she held over my son and me. But Mitchell is a generous man, she added, pausing for dramatic effect to make sure I heard every single word. He said he might reconsider. He said Dominic can stay, maybe even get a short extension on his pathetic lease, but on one condition. She leaned so close I could smell the overpowering scent of her heavy, expensive perfume. Mitchell says your son can stay if you come down to his corporate office tomorrow morning and beg. Personally. She stood up straight, adjusting her designer coat with a look of absolute triumph. Think about it, Edwin. 30 days to swallow your pride or watch your son lose everything he has worked for. See you at the wedding. With that, she turned on her heels and walked out of the diner, leaving the eviction notice and the shiny gold invitation resting on my table. I picked up the eviction notice Valerie had left on the sticky diner table, folded it with deliberate precision, and slipped it into the inside pocket of my faded brown jacket. The drive across town to the commercial district took less than 20 minutes, but my mind was already analyzing the variables of the war my ex-wife had just declared. I parked my reliable old sedan across the street from the weathered brick building on 4th Street. The faded sign above the heavy metal door read, Horizon Tech Repair. It was a deliberate decoy, a relic from our humble beginnings. I pushed open the heavy glass door and walked past the empty reception desk, making my way directly to the back server room. The industrial air conditioning hummed loudly, masking the sound of my deliberate footsteps. Inside the room, the glowing blue lights of the server racks illuminated the tense faces of 2 young men. Dominic, my son, stood with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. Beside him stood Gavin, my white son-in-law, a brilliant data analyst who had married my daughter Aaliyah 3 years ago. Gavin was staring intensely at a scanned copy of the exact same eviction notice Valerie had just handed me. They had already received it via certified mail. Gavin looked up as I entered the room, his face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and pure anger. Edwin Gavin began immediately, his voice tight with intense frustration and protective fury. This is completely illegal. Mitchell cannot just buy the building and throw us out with a 30-day notice. We have commercial tenant rights. I already have our corporate legal team on standby. I can have a court injunction filed by noon to freeze his assets. Dominic remained quiet, watching my reaction closely. He knew me better than to panic. I walked over to the main terminal, placed my hand gently on Gavin's tense shoulder, and smiled warmly. Cancel the legal team, Gavin, I said evenly. Do not file anything. Tell the logistics crew to start boxing up the servers tonight. We are packing up and moving out. Gavin stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. But Edwin, he argued, his hands gesturing wildly toward the servers. We cannot just let him kick us out onto the street. This is our foundation. I looked around the room, feeling a brief wave of nostalgia wash over me. Gavin was a loyal son-in-law, fiercely protective of our family, but he was reacting with emotion instead of cold strategy. He forgot the reality of our current situation. 5 years ago, when Valerie walked out and Mitchell maliciously stole the empty shell of my former business, Dominic and I took the core client list and quietly built Horizon Logistics from the ground up. This dusty brick building was where we wrote the first lines of code. We kept the lease purely for sentimental reasons and to maintain the perfect illusion of a struggling startup. What Valerie and Mitchell did not know was that this old building was nothing more than a shadow subsidiary. Our actual headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass skyscraper downtown. Our tech logistics empire was currently valued at a staggering $250 million, and we were preparing to go public. We did not need this decaying brick box. We had outgrown it years ago. Let him have the building, I explained calmly, maintaining my composed tone. If we fight the eviction, Mitchell will drag us into a public legal battle. During discovery, his lawyers will find out who we really are and how much we are truly worth. We are not going to give him the satisfaction or the information. We pack up, we disappear, we let him think he has won. Dominic finally nodded, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. He gets a dusty, empty building, Dominic said softly, and we keep our $250 million secret safe. Exactly, I confirmed. Let them celebrate their fake victory. Before Gavin could fully process the weight of the strategy, the sleek corporate phone resting on Dominic's desk began to ring loudly. The caller ID flashed Mitchell's name in bold black letters. Dominic looked at me, raising a questioning eyebrow. I gestured for him to answer it and put the device on speakerphone. The line clicked open, and Mitchell's booming, overly confident voice filled the server room. "Dominic, my boy." Mitchell laughed, his tone dripping with fake paternal affection and arrogant triumph. "I assume you got the paperwork this morning. I hate to do business this way, but real estate is a ruthless game. You understand, right?" I nodded to Dominic, signaling him to stay perfectly quiet. I leaned closer to the microphone. "Hello, Mitchell," I said smoothly. My voice was steady, betraying absolutely no emotion or surprise. There was a brief, sharp silence on the other end of the line. Mitchell had not expected me to be there, let alone sound so completely unbothered by his aggressive power play. Edwin Mitchell finally responded, recovering his arrogant swagger with a forced chuckle. "I hear Valerie dropped off an invitation for you earlier today. I hope there are no hard feelings about the building. It is strictly a financial decision. A man has to expand his portfolio to provide for his future bride." "I understand completely, Mitchell," I replied, my tone neutral. "Business is business. We will have the premises vacated well before the 30-day deadline." Mitchell let out a loud, patronizing sigh, clearly disappointed that I was not begging him for mercy. "Listen, Edwin, I am not a monster," he said, his voice oozing with unbearable condescension. "I know things have been incredibly tough for you, and I know Dominic is probably panicking right now. His little computer repair gig is clearly a dead end. I am willing to offer an olive branch to your family. I have a large janitorial staff at my main corporate office. I can offer Dominic a position. Night shift, mopping floors, taking out the trash. It pays minimum wage, but it will keep the boy from starving." "I appreciate the generous offer, Mitchell," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and absolutely flat. "But Dominic has other opportunities lined up. We do not need your charity today." Mitchell scoffed loudly, clearly irritated that his grand attempt to humiliate us had bounced off my impenetrable calm. "Suit yourself," Edwin Mitchell spat, the fake friendliness entirely gone from his voice. "Pride is a dangerous thing for a broke man to hold on to. But since you are feeling so independent and defiant, maybe you should warn your smart son-in-law about his own financial missteps." Gavin stiffened immediately, stepping closer to the phone, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about, Mitchell?" Gavin demanded, his voice sharp. Mitchell chuckled, a dark, venomous sound that echoed through the small room. "I am talking about that quaint little generational farm your elderly parents own out in the valley," Gavin Mitchell said maliciously. "They took out a risky agricultural loan a few years ago to keep the place afloat. Well, my acquisitions firm just bought out that specific debt from their local bank. They have missed 2 payments recently. I have already initiated a hostile corporate buyout. I am going to seize their land, bulldoze their precious farmhouse, and build a new luxury golf course. Have a great day, gentlemen." The line went dead with a sharp click, leaving a suffocating silence in the room as Gavin turned completely pale. Gavin lunged toward his secure workstation, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with frantic speed. He immediately accessed the private county property records and pulled up the financial history of his parents' generational farm. I stood behind him with Dominic, watching the lines of code and financial data scroll across the high-resolution monitors. Gavin breathed heavily, his eyes scanning the agricultural loan documents his father had signed 3 years ago during a severe drought. There it is, Gavin muttered, his voice thick with disgust. Mitchell found a buried clause in the original contract. It is a predatory banking loophole that allows the debt holder to accelerate the repayment schedule and initiate immediate foreclosure if 2 consecutive payments are missed by even a single day. Gavin slammed his fist against the heavy wooden desk. My parents mailed that last check on time, but the local bank deliberately delayed processing it right before Mitchell bought the debt. They set them up. Mitchell is legally within his rights to seize the land right now. I placed a steady hand on Gavin's shaking shoulder, reminding him that panic is the enemy of strategy. I told him to print the documents and secure a meeting with our corporate acquisition team. While we were analyzing Mitchell's ruthless legal maneuver, a different kind of confrontation was brewing across town. My daughter Aaliyah had just arrived at the exclusive private preschool to pick up my 5-year-old grandson Leo. Aaliyah is a brilliant, fiercely independent woman who serves as the secret chief executive officer of our massive tech conglomerate, but she always makes time to do the afternoon school run herself. As she stood near the polished iron gates waiting for the dismissal bell, a sleek black luxury car pulled up to the curb. Valerie stepped out wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a brand new luxury handbag. Valerie had not seen her grandson in nearly a year, but she was not there for a family reunion. She had intentionally tracked Aaliyah down just to gloat. Valerie marched right up to my daughter, aggressively thrusting her left hand forward to flash a massive glittering stone. Look closely, Aaliyah, Valerie boasted loudly, ensuring the other wealthy parents could hear every single word. This is a $50,000 flawless diamond. Mitchell bought it for me yesterday just because I asked. It is amazing what a real man can provide when he actually has ambition and resources. Aaliyah simply looked at the ring, then looked her mother directly in the eye with a perfectly blank expression. She had learned my stoic demeanor well. 5 years ago, when Valerie abandoned our family, Aaliyah had spent countless sleepless nights crying, wondering why her mother chose a flashy lifestyle over her own children. But those tears had long since dried, replaced by a cold, calculating business acumen that made her a terrifying force in the corporate world. Valerie, clearly annoyed by her daughter's lack of a dramatic reaction, decided to push harder. I heard about the trouble your husband is in, Valerie sneered, her voice dripping with venom. Mitchell told me he is taking away that dirty little farm from Gavin's parents. It is a shame you married such a useless white boy who cannot even protect his own family. Maybe if Gavin had a real job instead of playing with computers in that dusty brick building with your father, his parents would not be losing their home to my future husband. Aaliyah did not flinch. She did not raise her voice or defend Gavin's honor to a woman who fundamentally misunderstood the reality of our lives. Gavin was currently managing an algorithmic trading portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Aaliyah kept that multi-million-dollar secret perfectly concealed. She smoothly adjusted her designer coat, looked at Valerie with absolute freezing indifference, and spoke with terrifying calm. Is that all, Valerie? Aaliyah asked, her tone entirely devoid of emotion. Because if you are finished showing off a ring bought with borrowed money and insulting the father of my child, I have a son to pick up. Please step out of my way. You are blocking the gate. Valerie's face turned a violent shade of red. The wealthy mothers standing nearby were openly whispering and staring at the embarrassing display. Valerie thrived on intimidation and respect, and being publicly dismissed by her own daughter was the ultimate insult to her fragile, inflated ego. Do not you dare speak to me with that disrespectful tone, Valerie hissed, taking a threatening step forward. I am your mother. You should be begging me for help right now. If you showed a little gratitude, maybe I could convince Mitchell to give Gavin's pathetic parents a few extra days to pack their bags before the bulldozers arrive. Aaliyah smiled slightly, a razor-thin expression that mirrored my own. You stopped being my mother the day you stole my father's retirement funds and walked out the door, Aaliyah replied firmly. And as for Gavin's parents, do not concern yourself with their farm. We handle our own business. Now leave before I ask the campus security to escort you off the premises. Valerie gasped, her chest heaving with uncontrolled fury as she realized her intimidation tactics had completely failed. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Aaliyah's face. You arrogant little brat, Valerie spat maliciously. You think you are so smart standing by your broke father and your useless husband. You are going to regret disrespecting me today. I promise you, Aaliyah, I am going to make you pay for this insolence. I will take the one thing you actually care about. Valerie stormed back to her luxury car and sped away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a promise of absolute war. Aaliyah immediately called me to report the confrontation, her voice steady but laced with a dark warning. I told her not to worry, that Valerie was acting purely on emotion, a dangerous flaw in any strategic battle. But I severely underestimated the depths of my ex-wife's vindictive nature. At 8 o'clock the very next morning, I was sitting on my front porch enjoying my black coffee when a process server walked up the driveway and handed me a thick manila envelope. I opened the sealed legal document and felt my jaw tighten. It was a formal court summons filed by Valerie's aggressive legal team. She was not just lashing out wildly, she was executing a highly targeted strike. Valerie was officially suing the state for full legal and financial control of the multi-million-dollar trust fund I had secretly set up for my grandson Leo. Her legal justification was printed boldly on the first page. She was formally petitioning a judge to declare me senile, mentally degraded, and entirely financially incompetent to manage my own family's assets. I sat in the sleek mahogany-paneled conference room of Rosenberg and Associates, high above the bustling city streets. Across the polished glass table sat Benjamin Rosenberg, a corporate attorney known for his absolute ruthlessness in the courtroom. He was a shark in a tailored suit, the kind of man who destroyed rival corporations before his morning coffee. I handed him the court summons Valerie had sent, watching his sharp eyes scan the ridiculous claims of my supposed mental degradation. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. Before he could speak, I slid a second document across the table. It was a formal demand letter I had received just an hour ago from Mitchell's legal team. Mitchell was threatening to sue me for $100,000, claiming it was an unsettled business debt from our former partnership 5 years ago. Benjamin picked up the letter, his expression darkening with professional offense. Valerie wants control of your grandson's trust fund by declaring you senile, and Mitchell wants a quick payout based on a fabricated debt, Benjamin summarized, tapping his expensive pen against the glass. They are launching a coordinated legal assault to drain your resources. Benjamin leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with lethal intent. Give me the green light, Edwin, he urged, his voice cold and calculating. I can bury them in countersuits by this afternoon. I can expose Mitchell's shady accounting practices and have a judge throw out Valerie's petition with a single phone call to my medical experts. Let me crush them right now. I took a slow sip of the sparkling water the paralegal had poured, shaking my head calmly. No, Benjamin, I replied smoothly. We are not going to crush them today. We are going to let them think they have a winning hand. Benjamin frowned, clearly frustrated by my restraint. He did not fully understand the history between Mitchell and me. 5 years ago, when Valerie left me for him, Mitchell demanded total control of the modest logistics company we had started together. I did not fight him. I quietly signed over the physical assets, the office space, and the corporate name. I let him believe he had robbed me blind. What Mitchell did not realize was that I had legally retained ownership of our proprietary software code and the loyalty of our core client list. He stole a hollow shell. For half a decade, Mitchell had been parading around town as a successful CEO, while in reality he was running a dying company on absolute fumes. He had no real clients, no innovative technology, and a massive overhead he could barely afford. I knew his financial situation was a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. Suing me for an imaginary $100,000 debt was not an act of strength. It was an act of profound desperation. If we fight the lawsuit right now, I explained to my lawyer, Mitchell will just withdraw it and look for another way to attack. We need to find out why he needs that specific amount of money right at this exact moment. Benjamin respected my strategic patience. He immediately pulled out his laptop and accessed a private legal database, digging into the public financial filings of Mitchell's various shell companies. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Suddenly, Benjamin stopped, a triumphant smirk appearing on his face. Well, Edwin, your instincts are sharper than ever, Benjamin announced, turning his screen so I could see the highlighted financial documents. Mitchell does not actually expect to win this lawsuit against you. He knows the debt is completely fabricated and would never hold up in court. Then why spend the money on lawyer fees to file it? I asked, analyzing the data on the screen. Benjamin pointed to a specific paragraph in a commercial loan application. Because he is using the pending lawsuit as collateral, Benjamin explained. Mitchell applied for a $3 million line of credit at a major commercial bank yesterday morning. He listed the $100,000 lawsuit against you as guaranteed incoming assets to artificially inflate his company's valuation. He needs that massive loan to pay for the extravagant wedding he promised Valerie and to keep his failing business afloat. My ex-wife had demanded a $500,000 wedding complete with imported flowers, a five-star venue, and a designer dress to show the world she had upgraded her life. Mitchell was completely broke, but his ego refused to let him admit it to her. He was committing bank fraud, leveraging a fake lawsuit against me just to secure a massive loan he could never possibly repay. I leaned back in my leather chair, processing the sheer magnitude of his arrogance. Mitchell was literally betting his freedom on his ability to manipulate the banking system. Let the lawsuit proceed, I told Benjamin. If the bank approves his loan based on fraudulent documents, he will have committed a federal crime. We will have him exactly where we want him. Before Benjamin could agree to the plan, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open. Gavin stormed in, his tie loosened and his laptop clutched tightly under his arm. He ignored Benjamin completely and slammed the computer down on the glass table directly in front of me. I bypassed the commercial bank's external firewall using a proxy server. Gavin announced, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. I tapped into their automated loan approval system to track Mitchell's application. I looked at the screen, seeing the bright red text flashing across the bank's internal portal. "What am I looking at?" Gavin, I asked. "The loan was just denied." Gavin said, a dark intensity in his eyes. The underwriter flagged Mitchell's company as a massive credit risk. Mitchell is officially out of cash. He has zero liquid assets. Vendors are demanding deposits for the wedding by tomorrow, and he owes a fortune. Mitchell is desperate, Edwin. And desperate men do not play by the rules. He is actively looking for a quick illegal score right now. We immediately relocated from Benjamin's law firm to the secure underground server floor at Horizon Logistics. Dominic was already waiting at the central console when Gavin and I walked in. Gavin plugged his laptop directly into the mainframe, his fingers flying across the keys to initiate a ghost protocol. We were not going to wait for Mitchell to strike blindly in the dark. We were going to map every single digital footprint he had left over the last 5 years. Our proprietary software, originally designed to track global supply chain anomalies and optimize freight routes, was terrifyingly efficient when turned toward a single financial target. Dominic executed a silent, deep web audit, bypassing Mitchell's rudimentary corporate firewalls without triggering a single security alert. Within minutes, the massive monitors in our control room flooded with banking ledgers, private emails, offshore accounts, and hidden transaction histories. We had full, unrestricted access to the rotting core of his entire operation. It was a complete financial autopsy performed in absolute silence. I stood between my son and son-in-law, watching the green numbers scroll rapidly across the dark screens. Mitchell thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against an old man, but he did not realize we owned the entire board. Gavin isolated the primary cash flow algorithms, and the reality of Mitchell's so-called empire came into sharp, undeniable focus. The numbers did not just show a failing business struggling to stay afloat. They revealed a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme. For the past 4 years, Mitchell had not generated a single dollar of legitimate profit. Instead, he had been aggressively soliciting funds from wealthy, unsuspecting investors in our city, promising them astronomical returns on fake commercial real estate ventures. When it was time to pay dividends, he simply used the capital from his newest victims to pay off the older ones. He was shifting invisible money from one sinking account to another, desperately trying to keep the grand illusion alive. Dominic pulled up the personal expense ledgers, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Mitchell was drowning in short-term, high-interest loans just to maintain his flashy lifestyle. Every luxury car he drove was leased under shell companies that were currently in default. Then Gavin opened a specific file labeled wedding expenses and clicked on an invoice from a shady jeweler downtown. Valerie had proudly paraded her $50,000 flawless diamond in front of my daughter, mocking Gavin and claiming it was proof of Mitchell's superior wealth. The invoice on the screen proved otherwise. The ring was a rented cubic zirconia. Mitchell was paying $200 a month just to keep it on her finger, and he was currently 3 payments behind. I looked at the digital receipt, feeling a profound sense of vindication. 5 years ago, Valerie had stared at my modest bank accounts and told me I was a failure who could never provide true security. She traded a man who quietly built generational wealth for a fraudster who could not even afford the glass on her finger. The irony was exquisite. Mitchell had successfully convinced her that he was a king, but his entire kingdom was built on stolen sand. And now the sand was rapidly slipping through his fingers. He needed a massive influx of real cash immediately, or the entire Ponzi scheme would collapse, sending him straight to federal prison. The software suddenly flagged a high-priority alert, painting the center monitor with a bright red warning. Gavin swiftly minimized the financial ledgers and brought up a live interception of Mitchell's outgoing corporate emails. While we were digging through his past, Mitchell was actively making his desperate illegal move in the present. The intercepted message was sent from a burner account, but it was addressed directly to a low-level data entry clerk working in the customer service department of our own company. Dominic leaned closer to the screen, reading the encrypted correspondence. Mitchell had recognized that he could not hack our mainframe from the outside, so he had resorted to old-fashioned bribery. He had wired $10,000 to this junior employee, promising another $40,000 upon successful delivery of a specific digital asset. The target was the master contact file and proprietary contract details of Vanguard Shipping. Our biggest and most lucrative logistics client, Vanguard represented a $50 million annual contract. Mitchell was planning to steal the exact pricing models and executive contacts, intending to undercut our firm and present the stolen contract to his desperate investors as a massive new acquisition to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. The email included detailed instructions on how the employee should bypass our internal security flags by downloading the client file onto a simple external hard drive during the night shift. Dominic slammed his fist onto the console, his face twisting with absolute fury. The betrayal stung him deeply. He personally interviewed and hired every single employee in that department, trusting them to uphold the integrity of our company. Mitchell had found a weak link and was exploiting it perfectly. We watched the live feed as the employee replied to the email confirming receipt of the bribe and promising to execute the download by midnight. Mitchell was literally attempting to rob us from the inside out, using our own payroll against us to save his miserable life. "I will terminate the employee right now," Dominic declared, his voice tight with anger as he reached for the internal communications terminal. "I will have security escort him out of the building before he even logs in for his shift." Gavin nodded in fierce agreement, already typing commands to instantly lock down the Vanguard shipping files and freeze the employee's access credentials. "We can send this intercepted email directly to the police." Gavin added, his eyes locked on the monitor. "We have him dead to rights on corporate espionage." I stepped forward and placed a firm, steady hand on both of their shoulders, stopping their frantic movements. I looked at the glowing red alert on the monitor, feeling a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "No," I said warmly, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Do not fire the mole and do not lock the servers. Let him steal the client." Dominic stared at me, his eyes wide with utter confusion. "Let him steal a $50 million account?" he asked in disbelief. "Exactly," I replied. "In fact, I want you to lower the security protocols tonight. Make sure the file is incredibly easy to download." The trap worked flawlessly. By midnight, our internal monitoring software registered the complete data transfer. The corrupt employee downloaded the Vanguard shipping file onto a generic flash drive and walked right out the front door, believing he had just outsmarted a multi-million-dollar security system. Less than 12 hours later, Mitchell took the bait entirely. He could not contain his desperate need for public validation to soothe his nervous investors. Sitting in my office the next morning, Dominic pulled up Mitchell's professional social media profile on the main screen. Mitchell had just posted a picture of himself wearing a sharp-tailored suit, holding a crystal glass of champagne in what looked like a rented executive boardroom. The caption beneath the photo was dripping with arrogant triumph. He proudly announced a massive corporate victory, officially welcoming Vanguard Shipping to his portfolio as his newest million-dollar acquisition. He bragged to his followers and his anxious creditors that this aggressive expansion proved his business empire was unstoppable. He was actively parading his stolen prize for the entire financial sector to see, fully committing his public reputation and his company's future to a single stolen client file. Dominic scowled at the high-resolution screen, clenching his jaw as he read the congratulatory comments pouring in from Mitchell's gullible network of associates. He turned to me, clearly struggling to understand why I was sitting comfortably and watching a thief celebrate with our proprietary assets. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, settled deeply into my leather office chair, and looked at my son. It was time to reveal the exact reason I had ordered him to leave the digital doors wide open. 6 months ago, my private financial analysts flagged severe discrepancies in Vanguard's quarterly revenue reports. I quietly hired an elite independent forensic accounting firm to dig deeper into their corporate structure and operational habits. What we discovered was a catastrophic financial disaster carefully hidden behind cooked books and fraudulent tax returns. Vanguard was not just struggling to meet margins. They were secretly the target of a massive, multi-agency federal investigation for aggressive tax evasion, extensive wire fraud, and severe international labor violations. The Department of Justice had already frozen their offshore accounts in a sealed order, and the company was weeks, perhaps mere days away from a total and highly public bankruptcy. I had been planning to legally sever our logistics contract with them at the end of the month to protect Horizon Logistics from the inevitable incoming fallout. Mitchell, blinded by extreme greed and sheer desperation to save his own collapsing Ponzi scheme, had just proudly announced to the entire world that he was now officially partnered with a highly radioactive company. He had effectively chained his fragile, fraudulent business to a massive sinking ship. By publicly claiming Vanguard as his primary client and parading their contract on social media, Mitchell had just guaranteed that federal investigators would eventually follow the dirty money right into his own corrupt ledgers. He did my dirty work for me, isolating our company from the federal crosshairs and placing his own neck directly in the line of fire. Dominic's anger instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating grin as he finally realized the sheer magnitude of the trap Mitchell had just happily locked himself inside. While Mitchell was busy sealing his own financial and legal doom, Valerie was riding high on the illusion of her fiancé's fabricated success. Believing Mitchell had just secured a legitimate fortune that secured their lavish future, her arrogance reached an entirely new and dangerous level. That afternoon, without any prior warning or invitation, Valerie aggressively parked her rented luxury vehicle in the driveway of Aaliyah's quiet suburban home. Aaliyah was in her private home office, analyzing our quarterly profit margins, when the front doorbell rang relentlessly. She opened the heavy oak door to find her mother standing on the porch, clutching a glossy designer catalog and wearing an expression of absolute superiority. Valerie pushed her way inside without waiting to be welcomed, pacing through the living room as if she owned the property. She tossed the heavy catalog onto the glass coffee table, tapping a manicured finger aggressively on a specific page displaying a hideous, heavily beaded gown. Valerie coldly informed Aaliyah that she had officially selected the bridesmaid dresses for the upcoming wedding. The price tag for the dress was a staggering $10,000. Aaliyah stared at her mother in sheer disbelief, politely but firmly refusing to participate in such an absurd and wasteful financial demand. Valerie's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious and vindictive scowl. She leaned in close, attempting to assert physical dominance over a daughter who practically ran a tech empire in secret. Valerie demanded that Aaliyah purchase the expensive dress immediately to look presentable and prove to Mitchell's wealthy friends that she was not a complete financial failure. When Aaliyah firmly declined a second time, citing that she would not waste her money on a sham wedding, Valerie resorted to blatant extortion. She threatened to call every contact in their extended family and every prominent member of their local community to publicly spread malicious rumors. She promised to tell everyone who would listen that Aaliyah and Gavin were completely broke, that I was living in absolute squalor, and that our entire family was failing miserably without her superior guidance. Aaliyah did not flinch, apologize, or offer a single word of defense against the outrageous threats. She simply walked over to the front door, pulled it wide open, and coldly ordered her mother to leave the property immediately and never return. Valerie shrieked in pure indignation, promising absolute social ruin as she marched back to her car and slammed the heavy door. Aaliyah locked the deadbolt and immediately called me to report the ugly extortion attempt. We both knew Valerie was incredibly vindictive, but we severely underestimated her capacity for immediate public manipulation. Exactly 1 hour after being unceremoniously kicked out of Aaliyah's house, a sharp notification pinged on Dominic's phone in the server room. Valerie had just gone live on a highly popular social media platform. She was sitting in the driver's seat of her luxury car, staring directly into the camera with perfectly manufactured tears streaming down her face. In a trembling, heartbroken voice, she delivered a completely fabricated story to thousands of live viewers, claiming that her jealous ex-husband and her ungrateful daughter were intentionally subjecting her to severe emotional and financial abuse to ruin her upcoming wedding. By the time the sun set that evening, Valerie's fabricated, tearful video had spread through our local community like a vicious wildfire. She had expertly tagged the neighborhood association pages, our old church group, and even the local business forums. The digital sympathy poured in for her while the real-world consequences fell squarely on my shoulders. The next morning, I took my usual walk to the corner cafe for my black coffee. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. People I had known for decades suddenly avoided my gaze or whispered behind their hands as I passed them on the sidewalk. Mrs. Higgins, a woman I had helped repair her roof just last summer, pulled her purse closer to her chest and gave me a look of absolute disgust. Others offered patronizing smiles filled with misplaced pity, silently judging the cruel old man who was supposedly abusing his glamorous ex-wife and ungrateful daughter. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer a single word of defense to the gossiping crowd. Let them whisper their false narratives. I paid for my coffee in cash, gave the barista a polite nod, and drove straight to the glass skyscraper downtown. Public opinion is a fragile and ultimately useless currency. I stepped off the private elevator onto the secure executive floor of Horizon Logistics, leaving the petty suburban drama far behind me. Dominic and Gavin were already huddled around the massive central monitor in the control room. The screen was split into multiple live news feeds and financial tracking software windows. I completely ignored the buzzing alerts on my own phone from angry relatives who had seen Valerie's pathetic video. We had much larger prey caught in the snare. Dominic pointed to the main news feed, a tight, victorious smile breaking across his face. Breaking news banners flashed in bright red across the bottom of the screen. Federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service, backed by armed federal marshals, were currently raiding the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Shipping. News helicopters captured footage of federal agents carrying out dozens of hard drives and heavy boxes of encrypted financial records. Vanguard was not just a failing logistics company. They were the absolute epicenter of a massive offshore tax evasion syndicate, and the federal government had a strict policy of instantly freezing the assets of any entity claiming active partnership with them. Mitchell had proudly, loudly, and publicly declared himself their primary vendor less than 48 hours ago. Gavin rapidly tapped his mechanical keyboard, accessing the deep web financial monitors we had placed on Mitchell's business accounts. The impact was instantaneous and utterly devastating. Federal authorities had executed an emergency injunction. Every single corporate bank account tied to Mitchell's name was flashing with a bright red federal lock. The government had completely frozen his assets pending a full criminal audit due to his aggressively publicized association with Vanguard. The funds he was using to keep his illegal Ponzi scheme afloat were completely inaccessible. He could not withdraw a single cent, he could not pay his fake dividends, and he absolutely could not cover the massive overhead of his failing business. Mitchell had effectively handed the federal government the keys to his own corrupt kingdom, completely blinding himself with unearned pride. The absolute panic radiating from Mitchell's corporate office was practically visible through our intercepted communication channels. Dominic routed a live feed of Mitchell's business emails and private text messages to the main monitor. It was a digital bloodbath. Mitchell was frantically messaging his bank representatives, begging for a temporary release of funds, only to be met with cold, automated responses citing strict federal compliance laws. But the most immediate and crushing pressure was not coming from the government. It was coming directly from the wedding planners. Valerie had demanded a $500,000 spectacle, an event designed solely to flaunt her imagined superiority over me and my children. Mitchell had booked a grand estate, secured rare imported flowers, hired a celebrity catering team, and commissioned a custom designer gown. None of those high-end vendors worked on credit. Within an hour of the news breaking about the Vanguard raid, Mitchell's email inbox exploded with aggressive demands. The estate manager required a $200,000 non-refundable deposit by the close of business. The caterers demanded a $50,000 wire transfer. The florist threatened to cancel the entire floral arrangement unless payment was rendered immediately. Mitchell was officially cornered. If he failed to pay the vendors today, the extravagant wedding would be canceled, and Valerie would instantly discover that her billionaire fiancé was actually a bankrupt fraud. Her massive ego would never allow her to marry a broke man, especially after she had just publicly humiliated me and boasted about her superior new life. Mitchell was pacing his office, leaving frantic voicemails for his shady associates, but the word was already out on the street. No legitimate bank or peer would lend him a single dime while he was under active federal scrutiny. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and the desperate facade he had maintained for 5 long years was cracking under the immense pressure. I watched the frantic text messages flood his phone, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had built a fortress of lies, and we had simply removed the foundation. Desperation breeds monumental stupidity. Gavin tracked Mitchell's cell phone GPS signal as it abruptly left his corporate office building and sped aggressively away from the commercial district. We watched the blinking red dot on the digital map navigate toward the industrial outskirts of the city, a neglected and dangerous area known for unregulated salvage yards and predatory lending offices. The GPS signal stopped directly in front of a heavily fortified, windowless building bearing the name Apex Capital Solutions. It was a notorious high-interest private credit firm that catered specifically to desperate men who could no longer access the legitimate banking system. Mitchell grabbed his leather briefcase and marched into the shady establishment. He had no cash, no liquid assets, and his corporate accounts were federally frozen. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. But as Dominic intercepted the encrypted loan application Mitchell frantically submitted from his phone in the waiting room, we saw exactly what he was using as collateral. Mitchell was offering up Valerie's entire personal retirement fund, forging her signature on the digital documents to secure a predatory loan without her having the slightest idea. Mitchell sat in the cramped, windowless office of Apex Capital Solutions, wiping beads of cold sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. The air in the room was stale-smelling of cheap cigar smoke and sheer desperation. Across the scarred metal desk sat a loan officer with dead eyes sliding a thick stack of legal documents forward. Mitchell did not read the fine print. He could not afford to care about the details. The terms laid out before him were absolute financial suicide. He was borrowing $500,000 at a staggering 40% interest rate, a predatory trap meticulously designed to consume everything he had left. But Mitchell only saw a temporary lifeline to save his extravagant wedding and protect his fragile ego. The loan officer tapped a heavy pen against the final signature line, demanding the mandatory cosigner verification to authorize the funds. Mitchell swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he gripped the pen. Without a single moment of hesitation or moral conflict, he expertly forged Valerie's signature on the dotted line. With those few strokes of blue ink, he secretly pledged her entire personal retirement portfolio and the remaining equity in her assets as collateral for his toxic debt. He handed the papers back, breathing a heavy sigh of relief, completely unaware of the invisible noose he had just secured tightly around his own neck. An hour later, Mitchell walked through the grand double doors of the luxury estate he shared with Valerie, his posture completely transformed. The panicked, sweating fraudster who had just committed severe financial crimes in a dingy back office was entirely gone. In his place stood a man projecting the absolute arrogance of a victorious king returning from a successful conquest. Valerie was pacing the marble foyer, stressing over floral arrangements and the caterer's aggressive demands for payment. Mitchell strode up to her, flashing a brilliant manufactured smile, and pulled her into a confident embrace. He proudly announced that he had just secured a massive influx of liquid capital through a highly exclusive, brilliant investment strategy. He lied flawlessly, assuring her that the wedding vendors would be paid in full by the end of the day and that their lavish lifestyle was completely secure. Valerie practically swooned, her massive ego instantly inflated by the confirmation that she had aligned herself with a financial genius. She praised his business acumen loudly, comparing his aggressive success to my supposed pathetic complacency. She honestly believed she had won the ultimate prize. It was easy to see why Mitchell and Valerie remained so completely blind to our reality. When I raised Dominic and Aaliyah, I instilled in them a strict code of financial humility. I taught them that true power does not demand an audience. Despite controlling a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, my children drove reliable sedans, wore unbranded clothing, and lived in comfortable but unassuming neighborhoods. We never flashed our wealth, never bought yachts, and never sought validation from high society. Because we chose not to wear our bank accounts on our sleeves, Mitchell looked right past us. He measured a person's worth strictly by the brand of their watch and the logo on their car. He completely underestimated who he was dealing with, mistaking our deliberate modesty for financial failure. He assumed we were weak targets he could easily crush or ignore. That fatal miscalculation gave us the ultimate advantage. He thought he was outsmarting a retired old man and his struggling kids, never realizing he was playing a high-stakes game against absolute apex predators in the corporate world. Back in the secure executive suite at Horizon Logistics, the atmosphere was charged with quiet anticipation. I was reviewing our quarterly expansion reports when Gavin briskly walked into my office. He did not bother to knock, and the usual professional calm he carried had been replaced by a look of sheer predatory excitement. He was holding a secure digital tablet, the screen displaying a highly classified corporate acquisition manifest. Gavin placed the tablet precisely in the center of my mahogany desk, tapping the glowing screen with one finger. I looked down and read the header of the document. It was the finalized, digitally signed loan agreement Mitchell had just executed less than an hour ago. I frowned, slightly confused as to how Gavin had obtained the proprietary internal documents of a shady high-interest credit firm so quickly. Gavin leaned over the desk, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face as he revealed the ultimate twist. 2 years ago, as part of a tactical move to aggressively diversify our corporate portfolio and absorb high-yield debt structures, our parent conglomerate quietly purchased several private credit firms. We absorbed their assets, integrated their ledgers into our shadow subsidiaries, and let them continue operating under their original branding to avoid drawing attention from our competitors. One of those acquired firms was Apex Capital Solutions. Mitchell had driven to the darkest corner of the city, walked into what he thought was an untraceable predatory lending office, and unwittingly signed his financial death warrant directly over to us. He had legally bound himself to a brutal 40% interest rate and offered up Valerie's entire retirement fund as the sacrificial collateral. And he had handed that immense crushing power straight into the hands of the very family he was actively trying to destroy. I stared at the digital signatures on the screen, feeling a profound sense of awe at the absolute perfection of the trap. We did not just have evidence of his crimes. We legally owned his debt. We held the literal deed to his fake empire and Valerie's stolen future. Gavin stood eagerly by the desk, ready to execute the final blow. He asked for the immediate authorization to deny the funding, freeze the transaction, and send the fraudulent contract straight to the federal authorities. He wanted to watch Mitchell burn today. I looked at the digital contract tracing the forged signature of my ex-wife, the woman who had publicly humiliated me and attempted to extort my daughter just yesterday. I held the exact weapon that could instantly obliterate their lives, cancel their grand wedding, and send them both into a spiral of legal and financial ruin. I slowly slid the tablet back toward Gavin, my expression perfectly calm and chillingly resolved. "No," I instructed him, my voice steady and unwavering. "Approve the loan immediately. Wire the $500,000 directly into his accounts before the banks close today." Gavin paused, his eyes widening in shock. "You want to give him the money?" he asked. I smiled a cold and calculated gesture. "Yes," I replied. "Let them pay the vendors. Let them buy the expensive flowers and the designer dress. Let them build the most spectacular, expensive stage possible for their own public execution. Let them spend it all on the party." With the $500,000 successfully wired into his accounts from our shadow credit firm, Mitchell's inflated ego instantly regenerated. He actually believed his own fabricated genius had saved him from absolute ruin. Feeling financially invincible once again, he wasted no time executing the petty threats he had made just days prior. He wanted to make Gavin suffer for marrying into my family, and he wanted to prove to Valerie that he could ruthlessly crush the people she despised. Early the next morning, Mitchell dispatched 2 aggressive corporate representatives from his acquisitions firm directly to the generational farm owned by Gavin's elderly parents. These men were essentially high-priced thugs in cheap suits, instructed to officially serve the immediate foreclosure papers and physically intimidate the old couple into vacating their ancestral property by the end of the week. Mitchell assumed this would be an easy, devastating victory to kick off his lavish wedding weekend. He expected tears, panic, and desperate pleading from a vulnerable older couple who had nowhere else to go. What Mitchell's men did not expect was the welcoming committee waiting for them upon their arrival. Gavin and I were sitting comfortably on the wraparound wooden porch of the farmhouse, enjoying the crisp morning air with 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. We had known exactly when Mitchell would make his move. The 2 corporate thugs pulled their sleek black sedan into the dusty driveway, stepping out with an arrogant swagger that mirrored their employer's toxic confidence. They marched up the wooden steps, holding thick manila envelopes containing the legal foreclosure notices. They demanded to see the property owners, loudly declaring that the bank had accelerated the debt and the land was now the legal property of Mitchell's holding company. Gavin did not raise his voice. He stood up slowly, setting his coffee mug on the wooden railing, and walked down the steps to meet them face to face. When Gavin married my daughter Aaliyah, he integrated perfectly into our family because he shared our core values. His parents had worked this specific plot of land for over 40 years, building their livelihood with their bare hands. When they ran into financial trouble during a severe drought, their fierce independence and pride prevented them from asking their wealthy son for a handout. They wanted to handle their own debts. Gavin respected their pride, but he was also a brilliant financial analyst who knew how to protect his bloodline without bruising their egos. The thugs aggressively shoved the foreclosure papers toward Gavin's chest, ordering him to inform his parents that they had exactly 3 days to pack their belongings. Gavin did not even look at the documents. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase, resting on the porch chair, and pulled out a heavy, professionally bound legal binder. He stepped forward and shoved the binder directly into the chest of the lead representative with enough force to make the man stumble backward. "Read it carefully," Gavin instructed, his voice as cold and hard as steel. The corporate thug opened the binder, his arrogant smirk rapidly evaporating as his eyes scanned the certified legal documents bearing the official seal of the State Banking Commission. Gavin did not wait for him to finish reading. He delivered the reality check with absolute precision. "You are standing on private property owned entirely by Vanguard Equity Holdings," Gavin explained, naming the private equity branch he personally managed for our conglomerate. "Weeks ago, the moment my parents missed their first payment, my firm purchased the entirety of their agricultural debt directly from the local bank. We paid the balance in full, cleared all the liens, and transferred the deed free and clear. Mitchell's firm did not buy a valid debt portfolio. You bought a completely worthless, outdated piece of paper because your boss was too arrogant to verify the chain of title before trying to execute a hostile takeover." The two men stared at the documents in stunned silence. The paperwork was ironclad, signed by federal regulators, and completely unassailable. Mitchell had wasted significant capital purchasing a voided contract, and he had sent his men on a fool's errand. "You have absolutely no legal claim to this land," Gavin continued, his tone turning dangerously sharp. "Now get off my property before I have the local sheriff arrest you both for criminal trespassing and corporate harassment." The two men did not say another word. The realization that they had walked blindly into a massive legal trap drained all the aggressive energy from their posture. They practically ran back to their vehicle, throwing the useless foreclosure papers onto the passenger seat before speeding out of the driveway in a cloud of dust. Gavin and I stood on the porch, watching them retreat in absolute humiliation. We had successfully defended his family legacy without firing a single shot, using Mitchell's own blind arrogance against him. News of the humiliating defeat at the farm reached Mitchell within the hour. His bruised ego simply could not handle being legally outmaneuvered by the man Valerie had dismissed as a useless white boy. Enraged and desperate to reclaim some twisted sense of superiority, Mitchell retaliated in the most childish and pathetic way imaginable. Later that same afternoon, as I was reviewing market projections in my home office, a private courier knocked on my front door. He handed me a crisp, branded envelope directly from Mitchell's executive office. Inside was a physical handwritten check made out to me for exactly $500. Attached to the check was a heavy cardstock note scrawled in Mitchell's aggressive handwriting. The message read, "For your groceries, old man. Try not to starve before the rehearsal dinner." He actually thought a meager handout would insult my pride. He believed he was taunting a broken man, completely unaware that I was holding the leash to his entire financial existence. I looked at the $500 check, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face, perfectly anticipating the spectacular stage he had just set for tomorrow night. The following evening, the extravagant rehearsal dinner took place at the most exclusive country club in the city. I arrived exactly on time, stepping out of my reliable old sedan, while luxury sports cars and chauffeured vehicles filled the valet circle. I wore a neat, perfectly tailored but decidedly modest navy suit. It lacked the flashy designer labels and excessive tailoring that Mitchell's inner circle worshipped. As I walked into the grand banquet hall, the atmosphere shifted. The room was dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with imported white roses. Valerie was holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by her new network of wealthy, superficial friends. When they noticed me approaching, the whispers started immediately. Women in $1,000 cocktail dresses hid their snickers behind champagne flutes, while men in bespoke tuxedos cast condescending glances in my direction. They saw exactly what Valerie had conditioned them to see: a pathetic, discarded ex-husband who simply could not let go of the past. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely neutral, gliding through the room with the quiet confidence of a man walking into a trap he had built himself. Mitchell spotted me from across the room, and instantly saw an opportunity to cement his alpha status in front of his wealthy guests. He practically strutted over a smug, patronizing grin plastered across his face. He held a crystal glass in one hand and the exact same $500 check he had couriered to my house in the other. He had clearly brought a duplicate, intending to make this a public spectacle. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the entire room. The chatter died down as all eyes turned to us. Edwin, my old friend Mitchell, projected his voice so it echoed off the high ceilings. "I am so glad you could scrape together the gas money to make it tonight. I know things have been incredibly tight for you lately, and a man should not have to go hungry while his ex-wife eats caviar." He extended his hand, pushing the physical check directly against my chest. "Take it, Edwin. Consider it an early pension bonus from a man who actually knows how to build a legacy." The room erupted in a chorus of polite, cruel laughter. Mitchell had always been desperate for an audience needing constant validation to soothe the deep insecurities he harbored. 5 years ago, I might have felt the sting of that public humiliation. I had raised my children to believe that wealth was a silent utility, not a weapon for public abuse. Mitchell had always despised my quiet methodology, interpreting my lack of flash as a lack of ambition. Now he was desperately trying to use his fabricated wealth to break my spirit, completely unaware that his own financial execution was already in motion. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I calmly reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a solid brass fountain pen. I took the check from his fingers, turned it over, and pressed it against the nearest marble pillar. With swift, deliberate strokes, I endorsed the back of the document. A waiter in a crisp, white uniform happened to be walking past with a tray of champagne. I stopped him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Excuse me, young man," I said, my voice carrying a quiet but absolute authority that cut through the lingering laughter. "Please take this check and deposit it directly into the country club's annual charity drive. Ensure the funds are allocated specifically to the Foundation for Victims of Fraud and Embezzlement." The entire room went completely dead silent. Mitchell's face flushed a violent, blotchy shade of crimson. The utter silence in the banquet hall was deafening. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, nervous glances, completely unsure how to react to a supposed beggar casually donating a handout with such surgical precision. Valerie stood frozen near the towering swan ice sculpture, her mouth slightly open, the expensive champagne trembling visibly in her manicured hand. Mitchell had attempted to establish absolute dominance, but I had effortlessly flipped the narrative, exposing his grand gesture as nothing more than cheap, tacky theater. The sheer humiliation of being outmaneuvered in front of his elite creditors and high society peers caused something inside Mitchell to snap. His fragile, inflated ego simply could not process the defeat. Desperate to reclaim the spotlight and reassert his fabricated financial supremacy, Mitchell raised his voice, shouting over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "You can play your little mind games all you want, Edwin." Mitchell barked, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "But you and your pathetic children will always be nothing compared to the empire I am building. You think you are so smart handing away pocket change. Well, listen closely, all of you. This Friday, just hours before my wedding, I am officially signing a master government logistics contract with the Department of Defense." Mitchell paced back and forth, addressing the entire room, now his voice dripping with absolute mania. "It is a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bid. I have already secured the preliminary approvals and the backing of top federal officials. Once my signature hits that contract, my company will completely monopolize the Eastern Seaboard supply chain. I will not just be rich, Edwin. I will be a verified billionaire. My net worth will eclipse anything your tiny broken brain can even comprehend." He raised his glass to the stunned audience, forcing a victorious laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. Valerie quickly rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him and glaring at me with renewed vicious arrogance, thoroughly convinced that her fiancé had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. I maintained my neutral expression, offering them a simple, polite nod before turning away from the spectacle. I walked toward the back of the room where my daughter Aaliyah had been standing in the shadows, quietly observing the entire confrontation. She held a glass of sparkling water, her eyes fixed on Mitchell with a look of absolute, chilling, predatory focus. As I approached, she leaned in close, ensuring no one else could hear her words over the resumed chatter of the confused guests. Dad Aaliyah whispered, her voice completely devoid of panic but laced with a dangerous realization. That multi-billion-dollar Department of Defense logistics contract he is bragging about, that is our contract. My executive team submitted the finalized federal bid 3 months ago. Mitchell does not have the infrastructure, the security clearance, or the routing algorithms to even qualify for a preliminary government review. He cannot win it legitimately. I looked back at Mitchell, who was aggressively downing his champagne and soaking up the false admiration of his peers. Then how does he plan to sign it on Friday? I asked quietly. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed into a terrifying glare. He is planning to steal our proprietary software source code, she replied coldly. He is going to launch a cyber attack against our main servers before the wedding. The revelation from Aaliyah shifted our entire strategy. We knew Mitchell was planning a cyber attack to steal our proprietary software, but the very next morning Mitchell hit a massive bureaucratic wall that temporarily halted his grand theft. To even submit a federal bid to the Department of Defense, let alone secure the multi-billion-dollar logistics contract, the government strictly required an upfront, non-refundable $2 million surety bond. This bond acted as absolute proof of corporate liquidity and operational capability. Mitchell sat in his dark, quiet office staring in pure panic at his frozen banking portals. The federal raid on Vanguard Shipping had legally locked every single legitimate cent he ever possessed. Furthermore, the predatory $500,000 loan he had just acquired from our shadow company was entirely allocated to paying off his furious wedding vendors. He had absolutely no liquid assets, no available credit lines, and no legitimate business partners left to exploit. His grand illusion of becoming a billionaire was suddenly separated by a massive $2 million paywall he could not legally cross. He needed hard collateral immediately, or his entire fabricated empire would collapse before he even reached the altar. Mitchell's sheer desperation rapidly mutated into pure, unadulterated criminality. While he was frantically pacing his office trying to conjure money from thin air, Valerie was miles away, completely oblivious to his impending financial collapse. She was indulging in an exclusive all-day bridal spa retreat, receiving expensive treatments and sipping champagne with her superficial friends to prepare for her grand walk down the aisle. Knowing she would be entirely unreachable and distracted for hours, Mitchell drove his leased luxury vehicle straight back to their shared estate. He bypassed the perimeter security system and went directly into Valerie's private dressing room. Tucked behind a row of designer shoes sat a hidden wall safe. Mitchell already knew the digital combination. He opened the heavy steel door and completely ignored the expensive jewelry resting on the velvet shelves. His sole target was a thick folder of legal documents. He reached in and pulled out the original property deed to the sprawling mansion they currently lived in. 5 years ago, when Valerie walked out of my life, she demanded exactly half of my liquid savings in our divorce settlement. I handed over those funds without a single argument, allowing her to believe she had financially ruined me while I quietly protected my real assets. She used every cent of that settlement money to purchase this exact estate outright in cash. She deliberately put the deed solely in her own name to ensure I could never touch it. It was her ultimate prize, her absolute proof that she had conquered the world and upgraded her life without me. Now the very man she left me for was holding that precious deed in his trembling, greedy hands. He fully intended to gamble away her entire safety net just to maintain his own fragile ego. He shoved the property deed into his leather briefcase and quickly slipped out of the house, leaving no physical trace of his betrayal. Mitchell drove aggressively to a dilapidated commercial strip mall located on the industrial edge of the city limits. He walked into a cramped, dusty office belonging to a notoriously corrupt notary public. This was a man well known in the local financial underworld for rubber stamping fraudulent real estate transactions in exchange for a hefty cash bribe. Mitchell slid the original property deed across the scratched wooden desk, accompanied by a stack of high-interest commercial loan applications. He explained that he needed the $2 million surety bond issued today, and he was using Valerie's fully paid mansion as the sole collateral to secure it. The corrupt notary pushed the heavy stack of documents back across the desk, handing Mitchell a black pen and pointing directly to the primary co-signer's signature line. Without a shred of hesitation or a single ounce of guilt, Mitchell flawlessly forged Valerie's signature right on the dotted line. He legally bound the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 48 hours to a massive unpayable commercial debt, effectively placing a ticking foreclosure clock directly on the roof of her dream home. He handed over a thick envelope of cash to the notary, who aggressively applied his official state seal to the fraudulent paperwork, making the devastating crime legally binding. What Mitchell did not know was that Benjamin Rosenberg, my exceptionally ruthless corporate lawyer, leaves absolutely nothing to chance. Following the disastrous confrontation at the rehearsal dinner, Benjamin had officially dispatched a team of elite private investigators to monitor Mitchell's every move. Parked across the street in an unmarked utility van, a surveillance expert captured the entire illegal transaction through the dusty blinds of the notary office using a high-powered telephoto lens. Every stroke of the pen, every exchange of illicit cash, and every fraudulent stamp was recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition video. I was sitting quietly on the wooden porch of my unassuming suburban home later that afternoon reviewing the surveillance footage Benjamin had just securely messaged to my phone. A familiar luxury car aggressively pulled into my driveway tires, crunching loudly against the gravel. Valerie stepped out fresh from her expensive spa treatments and radiating absolute unchecked arrogance. She marched purposefully up the wooden steps and threw a thick white envelope directly onto my lap. It landed on my legs with a heavy thud. I looked inside and saw a stack of crisp $100 bills totaling exactly $5,000. "Take it and leave town for the weekend," Edwin, Valerie demanded, her voice cold, commanding and dripping with utter disdain. "Go rent a cheap motel somewhere far away from here. My wedding photographer is taking sweeping drone shots of this entire neighborhood tomorrow morning, and I do not want your depressing presence sitting on this porch ruining the aesthetic of my perfect day." I stared down at the thick stack of crisp $100 bills resting heavily on my legs. The utter audacity of the gesture hung in the quiet suburban air, thick and suffocating. Valerie stood over me with her arms crossed, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her side. She was expecting a violent outburst, a screaming match, or perhaps a pathetic display of a broken man begging for his dignity. I gave her exactly what she needed to see. I let my shoulders slump forward, physically deflating under the imaginary weight of her cruelty. I slowly reached down with trembling hands and picked up the white envelope. I stared at the wooden floorboards of my porch, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute defeat. I did not look her in the eye. I simply nodded once, offering a gesture of total submission from a man who had supposedly lost his final shred of pride. I carefully tucked the envelope into the pocket of my faded jacket, acting as though this humiliating bribe was the only lifeline I had left in the world. I murmured a quiet, broken apology, promising her I would pack my bags and be gone before the sun rose tomorrow. I assured her I would not ruin her perfect photographs or cast a shadow over her perfect day. Valerie let out a sharp, triumphant laugh that echoed off the neighboring houses. She spun on her expensive heels and marched back to her luxury car, radiating absolute superiority with every step. She had finally conquered me, or so she firmly believed. Before she even started the engine, she pulled out her phone. Through the surveillance software Dominic had discreetly linked to Mitchell's devices, I knew exactly what she was typing. She sent a text directly to her fiancé that read, "The old man is completely broken. We won." She drove away, leaving me alone on the quiet porch. I pulled the envelope of cash from my pocket, my trembling hands instantly steadying. The pathetic facade melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I looked at the money, realizing it was just another desperate attempt to control a narrative that had already slipped entirely from her grasp. I remembered vividly the rainy morning 5 years ago when she walked out that very same front door. She had stood in the entryway with her expensive luggage, looking at me with pure, unfiltered disgust. She told me that a real man fights for his woman, that a man of true worth would tear down the world to keep her from leaving. I did not fight for her that day. I let her walk away into Mitchell's waiting arms without raising my voice or shedding a single tear. She interpreted my silence as weakness, as the ultimate proof of my lack of ambition. But as I sat there holding her pathetic bribe, I realized the profound truth of my actions. Real men do not fight to keep toxic, manipulative people in their lives. Real men fight for their absolute peace. I fought to protect my children, my sanity, and the quiet empire we were building together. Valerie wanted a chaotic battle over her affection, but I gave her the silence she needed to destroy herself. I took the $5,000, walked inside my house, and tossed the envelope onto the kitchen counter. I would use it to buy Dominic and Aaliyah a celebratory dinner after we executed the final phase of our operation. While Valerie was prematurely celebrating her fabricated victory, Mitchell was aggressively executing his final desperate maneuver. He was sitting in his dark, chaotic corporate office, staring at the fast-approaching deadline for the Department of Defense logistics contract. He had the fraudulent $2 million surety bond secured with Valerie's stolen property deed, but he still lacked the actual proprietary software required to operate the military supply chain. He could not build the complex algorithm, and he certainly could not buy it. He had to steal it directly from Horizon Logistics. Mitchell reached out to a dangerous contact in the criminal underworld and hired a notoriously ruthless black hat hacker. This was not a cheap operation. Mitchell drained the very last of his predatory loan funds to pay the mercenary for an immediate brute force cyber attack. The target was Dominic's main server farm, the exact system Mitchell believed was highly vulnerable. In his arrogant mind, Dominic was still just a naive kid running a struggling startup out of a dusty brick building on 4th Street. Mitchell provided the hacker with the IP addresses and the backdoor access codes he had purchased from his bribed mole inside our customer service department. Mitchell sat gripping the edge of his mahogany desk, sweating profusely as he watched a shared screen connection with the hacker. The mercenary initiated the breach, deploying a barrage of aggressive malware designed to smash through corporate firewalls and extract raw source code. Mitchell's entire future, his billionaire fantasy, and his freedom from federal prison depended entirely on the success of this digital heist. He needed our routing algorithms to slap his own corporate logo on them and submit the federal bid by midnight. He felt absolutely no remorse for stealing from his former best friend or his best friend's son. He only felt the intoxicating rush of impending wealth. He convinced himself that taking this software was his right, a necessary step for a man of his superior intellect and ambition. The hacker worked in complete silence, running complex decryption scripts that systematically dismantled what Mitchell assumed were Dominic's amateur security protocols. Every second that passed without a blaring security alarm convinced Mitchell of his own flawless genius. On Mitchell's monitor, the black screen filled with cascading lines of green code as the hacker successfully bypassed the initial security gates. Mitchell held his breath, his eyes wide with manic anticipation. The hacking software indicated a direct connection to the Horizon Logistics mainframe. A progress bar appeared on the screen, slowly ticking upward as it initiated the massive file transfer. 10%, 30%, 60%. Mitchell leaned closer to the monitor, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The system did not trigger a single alarm. The extraction was proceeding with terrifying smoothness. The progress bar finally hit 100%, flashing a bright green notification that the proprietary source code had been successfully downloaded to a secure external drive. The hacker sent a brief confirmation message and severed the encrypted connection. Mitchell let out a loud, breathless laugh of absolute triumph. He stared at his computer screen, a wicked, victorious smirk stretching across his sweating face. He had the code. The keys to a multi-billion-dollar government contract were finally resting comfortably in his possession. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, completely convinced that he had just secured his legacy and outsmarted my entire family. Deep inside the climate-controlled server fortress of Horizon Logistics, Dominic and Gavin stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a massive curved monitor. The blue glow of the screens illuminated their highly focused faces. They were watching a live feed of the digital heist as it happened in real time. A bright red progress bar on their end matched the exact percentage Mitchell was seeing on his own stolen monitor. Mitchell's IP address was actively draining gigabytes of data from what he firmly believed was our core corporate directory. Gavin typed a rapid sequence of commands to ensure the connection remained perfectly stable, granting the hired black hat hacker an uninterrupted flow of information. They watched the final data packet complete its journey, confirming the successful transfer of our supposed logistics source code directly to Mitchell's personal desktop. Dominic let out a low, deeply satisfied laugh, crossing his arms over his chest as the connection was deliberately severed from our end. Mitchell actually believed his hired mercenary had bypassed a multi-million-dollar enterprise security system. He had absolutely no idea that Dominic had personally unlocked the front door and laid out a digital red carpet. Dominic did not just let the hacker in. He had spent the last 48 hours engineering a flawless honeypot. It was a decoy server completely isolated from our actual proprietary network, filled with thousands of dummy files designed to look exactly like our classified Department of Defense bidding algorithms. But these files were not just useless lines of code. They were highly aggressive self-executing malware packages. The exact moment Mitchell proudly opened the stolen folder on his computer, the malware silently activated. It acted as a digital parasite, burying itself deep into the root directory of Mitchell's operating system without triggering a single antivirus alert. Back in our server room, a new window popped open on Dominic's monitor. The malware was now executing a rapid two-way mirror synchronization. It was aggressively copying every single byte of data from Mitchell's private hard drive and funneling it directly back to our secure servers in real time. I stood behind my son and son-in-law watching the incoming data stream with a quiet sense of absolute awe. Years ago, when I first started teaching Dominic the basics of computer programming on a bulky secondhand desktop, Valerie had constantly mocked his interests as a complete waste of time. She demanded that I force him to study traditional finance, completely blind to the technological revolution unfolding around us. Now, the very skills she openly despised were actively dismantling her future husband's entire fabricated empire. The incoming file transfer took less than 10 minutes to completely drain Mitchell's digital life. Gavin immediately ran a high-speed decryption protocol on the stolen cache, organizing the incoming data into neat categorized folders. What materialized on our monitors was a comprehensive, undeniable roadmap of a master criminal. We did not just find evidence of his recent desperation. We uncovered a massive, perfectly preserved archive of every illegal action Mitchell had committed over the past half-decade. Gavin clicked open a master spreadsheet labeled Offshore Equity. It contained the exact ledgers of his sprawling Ponzi scheme, documenting the hundreds of unsuspecting investors he had defrauded and the exact routing numbers he used to shuffle their money into fake dividends. The next folder revealed high-resolution scans of stolen notary stamps, fake commercial real estate deeds, and the digital paper trail of the predatory loans he had secured using fraudulent collateral. The most damning piece of evidence was a folder containing the raw, unedited security footage of Mitchell personally forging Valerie's signature on the $2 million surety bond just hours earlier. He was so arrogant that he had actually kept a digital copy of the forged document right on his desktop. Gavin stared at the screen, his jaw dropping as he processed the sheer volume of federal offenses scrolling past his eyes. We had tax evasion, wire fraud, identity theft, corporate espionage, and grand larceny all neatly packaged in one place. The files currently sitting on our servers contained enough hard, irrefutable evidence to put Mitchell inside a maximum security federal penitentiary for at least 20 consecutive years. His entire life was officially resting in our hands. Gavin slammed his fist onto the console in sheer excitement, his eyes blazing with a fierce sense of justice. He immediately opened a secure communication portal, his fingers hovering rapidly over the keyboard. "I am routing this entire data dump directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI right now," Gavin declared, his voice tight with pure adrenaline. "We can have federal marshals kicking down his office door before he even finishes his morning coffee. We can end this right here." I stepped forward and placed a heavy, firm hand directly onto Gavin's shoulder, physically stopping him from hitting the enter key. The room fell completely silent as Dominic and Gavin both turned to look at me, absolute confusion flashing across their faces. I looked at the undeniable proof of Mitchell's complete destruction glowing brightly on the screen, and I shook my head slowly. "No," I commanded, my voice dropping to a cold, terrifyingly calm register. "Do not send a single file to the authorities yet. Disconnect the server and lock down the evidence." Gavin stared at me, completely baffled by my restraint. "But Edwin, we have him," Gavin protested. "Why are we waiting?" I looked at the digital calendar displayed in the corner of the monitor. The lavish $500,000 wedding was scheduled to begin in less than 48 hours. "Let them walk down the aisle," I instructed, a dark, permanent resolve settling deep into my bones. "Let Valerie put on her expensive white dress and swear her life to him in front of all her superficial friends. We are not doing anything until they sign that marriage certificate. Their union must be absolutely legally binding first." The heavy silence in Mitchell's office was violently shattered by the harsh ringing of his private cell phone. It was a restricted number. When he answered, the voice on the other end belonged to a collection agent from Apex Capital Solutions. The agent did not offer a polite greeting. He bluntly informed Mitchell that their risk assessment department had just been notified of the federal raid on Vanguard Shipping. Because Mitchell had publicly linked his entire financial portfolio to a company now under active federal investigation, his corporate accounts were frozen, rendering his financial profile a massive liability. The agent declared that the terms of the predatory loan had been breached. The lender was officially invoking the emergency acceleration clause. They demanded the immediate repayment of the $500,000 plus the exorbitant 40% interest by the close of business today. Mitchell felt the blood drain completely from his face. He stammered, begging for a tiny extension, explaining that the wedding was in exactly 48 hours and his funds were temporarily tied up. The agent coldly replied that they did not care about his social calendar. If the money was not wired by sunset, they would initiate immediate asset seizure. Panic consumed Mitchell entirely. He slammed the phone down, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was trapped in a financial vice, and the collection agents from Apex Capital Solutions were threatening to crush him before he could even put on his tuxedo. He needed a massive infusion of untraceable cash right now, just enough to buy the lenders a few days of silence. His frantic mind raced through a list of potential victims, searching for anyone he could easily extort. He landed on Gavin. Mitchell quickly dialed Gavin's personal number, his mind concocting a vicious and desperate blackmail scheme. When Gavin answered, Mitchell bypassed any small talk and went straight for the throat. He aggressively claimed that he had recently hired a digital artist to create highly realistic doctored photos of Gavin in deeply compromising situations with other women. Mitchell threatened to leak these fabricated images directly to Aaliyah, to her entire family, and to the local press. He promised to completely destroy Gavin's marriage and humiliate him publicly unless Gavin quietly wired $100,000 to an offshore account within the hour. Mitchell had always harbored a deep, simmering resentment toward my son-in-law. He looked at Gavin and saw the authentic loyalty and quiet strength that he himself could never achieve. Mitchell naturally assumed that Gavin, a young man who had married into my family, would be absolutely terrified of losing his wife and his comfortable position. He calculated that Gavin would eagerly pay the ransom to avoid any manufactured scandal. Mitchell believed he was striking at the weakest link in our family armor. He was completely unaware that he was attempting to extort a man who managed hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate equity and who was currently standing in a secure server room watching Mitchell's entire digital life collapse in real time. Gavin stood perfectly still in our underground server room, holding his phone out so Dominic and I could hear every single desperate word. He had immediately placed the call on speakerphone. We listened in absolute silence as Mitchell aggressively detailed his pathetic extortion plot, demanding the money with the frantic energy of a drowning man. Mitchell painted a vivid picture of the destruction he would cause, practically screaming into the receiver that he held Gavin's entire future in the palm of his hand. When Mitchell finally paused to take a breath, waiting for the panicked submission he expected, Gavin simply let out a sharp, freezing laugh. It was a sound entirely devoid of fear, echoing coldly off the server racks. Mitchell demanded to know what was so funny, his voice cracking with sudden uncertainty. Gavin leaned closer to the phone, his tone dropping to a precise, terrifying calm. "You really do not understand how real relationships work, Mitchell," Gavin stated smoothly. "My marriage is built on absolute transparency and total trust. Aaliyah and I do not keep secrets. You could print those fake photos on billboards across the city and she would not blink an eye. We know exactly who you are, and more importantly, we know exactly how desperate you have become today." Mitchell stammered, trying to double down on his empty threats, but Gavin cut him off with surgical precision. "Extortion is a severe federal crime, Mitchell," Gavin continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "It is just one more massive mistake to add to your rapidly growing list of catastrophic failures. You do not have leverage, Mitchell. You have a ticking time bomb sitting directly in your lap, and you are entirely out of time. Enjoy the next 48 hours. See you at the altar." Gavin abruptly terminated the call, leaving Mitchell listening to a dead silent line. Mitchell dropped his phone onto his mahogany desk, his hands shaking violently as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. The extortion attempt had failed spectacularly, leaving him completely exposed and utterly devoid of options. He was trapped between ruthless private creditors demanding a fortune he did not possess and a family that was completely immune to his manipulative tactics. He paced his dark office, wiping cold sweat from his neck, his mind frantically searching for a final lifeline. His eyes locked onto the extravagant gold-foiled wedding invitation resting perfectly on the corner of his desk. A twisted, desperate sense of rationalization washed over him. He convinced himself that the upcoming ceremony was his ultimate and only salvation. Once he stood at the altar and officially signed that legal marriage certificate, Valerie's remaining trust funds, her sprawling estate, and all her physical assets would instantly become joint marital property. He calculated that her wealth would be the perfect shield to satisfy his aggressive lenders and protect him from federal ruin. He just needed to stall the inevitable collapse for 48 more hours. He stared at the invitation, repeating a single desperate mantra in his head. He just needed to make it down the aisle and say I do. The morning of the wedding arrived with brilliant, mocking sunshine. The sprawling, historic estate Valerie had demanded was completely transformed into a $500,000 spectacle of absolute excess. Thousands of rare white orchids hung suspended from the vaulted ceilings of the grand reception tent, swaying gently in the manufactured breeze. Massive, intricately carved ice sculptures, shaped like swans, guarded the entrances, slowly weeping cold water onto the manicured green lawns under the intense afternoon heat. Towering pyramids of imported crystal champagne glasses stood on velvet-draped tables waiting to be filled with vintage wine that Mitchell had secured using fraudulent credit. Waiters in crisp white uniforms rushed across the pristine grounds carrying silver trays of expensive caviar and delicate appetizers. It was a flawless, meticulously constructed illusion of limitless wealth and high society grace. Every single detail had been designed to project an image of absolute superiority and unmatched financial power. The string quartet tuned their expensive instruments on a raised wooden stage, playing soft classical music that masked the incredible tension brewing just beneath the surface. It was the perfect stage for a king and queen built entirely on a decaying foundation of stolen money and desperate lies. High above the manicured gardens, locked inside the lavish master bridal suite of the estate, Valerie was holding court like a ruthless tyrant. She stood in front of a gilded, full-length mirror draped in a custom-designed silk gown that cost more than most people earned in an entire year. She was aggressively barking orders at her terrified styling team, snapping her manicured fingers and demanding absolute perfection. When a young makeup artist accidentally smudged a tiny line of mascara, Valerie viciously berated the girl until she was on the verge of tears, threatening to ruin her career in the city. Valerie felt completely invincible today. Looking at her own reflection, she thought back to the cheap, modest backyard barbecue where she had married me 40 years ago. She had worn a simple off-the-rack cotton dress and carried flowers we had picked ourselves from a local field. She had spent decades resenting that humble beginning, convinced she had been robbed of a royal life. Today was her ultimate vindication. She firmly believed she was finally ascending to her rightful place among the elite, utterly oblivious to the financial slaughterhouse waiting for her at the altar. While Valerie was busy terrorizing the venue staff upstairs, my family and I quietly arrived at the grand estate. Dominic, Aaliyah, Gavin, and I walked through the towering iron gates, dressed in modest, unassuming dark suits and simple dresses. We did not mingle with the wealthy guests sipping pre-ceremony cocktails on the stone terrace. We bypassed the extravagant photo booths and the loud, superficial chatter of Mitchell's fake corporate associates. We moved like shadows through the crowd, carrying the silent weight of the absolute destruction we held in our hands. We made our way directly to the sprawling outdoor ceremony space, taking our seats in the very last row of the white wooden folding chairs. We sat in perfect silence, completely unnoticed by the glittering sea of attendees who were too busy admiring the expensive floral arrangements and designer outfits to pay attention to the quiet family they had spent 5 years mocking. Down at the front of the pristine white aisle, standing beneath a massive archway of imported white roses, Mitchell was physically deteriorating in real time. He wore a bespoke imported tuxedo that was supposed to make him look like a confident billionaire, but he was sweating so profusely that dark, damp patches were already forming under his arms and staining his crisp white collar. He continuously wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief, his eyes darting frantically around the outdoor venue like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. The source of his absolute terror was resting heavily in the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. His private cell phone was vibrating relentlessly against his chest, a continuous, violent buzzing that signaled his impending doom. The ruthless collection agents from Apex Capital Solutions had somehow discovered his physical location. They were sending a barrage of aggressive, terrifying text messages, threatening to send armed enforcers directly to the estate to break his legs if the $500,000 loan was not wired immediately. Mitchell could literally feel the expiration of his freedom and his physical safety vibrating against his ribs. He desperately checked his expensive gold watch, his breathing shallow and erratic. He grabbed the elbow of the elderly officiant standing next to him, his grip tight and frantic. Mitchell aggressively hissed at the man, demanding that he skip the traditional opening prayers and expedite the vows. He needed this ceremony to start right now. He needed to hear those binding words and sign the legal marriage certificate in front of witnesses before the loan sharks arrived to exact their violent revenge or before federal agents showed up to freeze the entire event. He firmly believed that the exact second he placed that ring on Valerie's finger and signed the state documents, her remaining trust fund and the sprawling mansion he had fraudulently mortgaged would legally become joint marital property. He calculated that her assets were the only shield thick enough to protect him from federal prison and the violent creditors actively hunting him down. He just needed to survive the next 20 minutes and cross the legal finish line. The string quartet abruptly shifted their melody, playing the grand swelling notes of the traditional bridal march. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the estate swung open and the entire crowd stood up in unison. Valerie stepped out onto the pristine white aisle runner, clutching a cascading bouquet of rare orchids. She beamed with absolute unchecked triumph, soaking in the collective awe of the wealthy attendees. She walked slowly, making sure every single guest witnessed her grand ascension. As she passed the final rows of chairs, her eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto mine. I was sitting perfectly still in the very back row, surrounded by my loyal children. Valerie did not look surprised to see me. Instead, she offered me a slow, condescending smile, her eyes dripping with absolute unfiltered pity. She believed I had shown up to witness my own ultimate defeat, a pathetic old man watching his ex-wife marry a billionaire. I held her gaze without blinking, offering a polite, chillingly calm nod in return. She turned her head forward, marching proudly toward the sweating, terrified fraudster waiting at the altar. The officiant raised his hands and the ceremony officially began. The officiant stepped up to the microphone, his voice echoing across the manicured lawns and rows of white chairs, asking the couple to share the vows they had written for each other. Mitchell practically snatched the microphone from the older man's hand. He rushed through his vows with a frantic, breathless pace, stumbling over the romantic words as if he were reading a legal disclaimer he desperately wanted to bypass. He spoke rapidly about securing their future and finalizing their union, entirely missing the emotional weight of a normal wedding ceremony. His eyes kept darting nervously toward the estate entrance, terrified that a squad of armed loan sharks or federal agents was about to storm the gates and drag him away. He shoved the microphone toward Valerie the exact second he finished his final hurried sentence. Valerie, completely misinterpreting his frantic rush as overwhelming passion and eagerness to claim her, took the microphone with slow, practiced theatricality. She turned to face the audience, ensuring all her wealthy guests were hanging on her every word. She delivered a long, incredibly pretentious speech about destiny and high social status. She loudly proclaimed that she had finally found a real man of wealth and stature, someone who truly understood how to treat a woman of her supreme caliber. She made thinly veiled, venomous jabs at her past, emphasizing how she had miraculously upgraded her existence and escaped a life of boring mediocrity. I sat perfectly still in the back row, my face an impenetrable mask of calm as her sharp words washed over the quiet crowd. Dominic shifted slightly in his folding chair, his jaw tightening at the blatant disrespect aimed directly at me, but I placed a steadying hand on his knee to keep him grounded. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or humiliation. I felt only the quiet, icy anticipation of an architect watching a controlled demolition sequence execute exactly on schedule. Listening to Valerie boast about her billionaire groom transported me back to the rainy morning 5 years ago when she first walked out the door of our modest home. I remembered the heavy thud of her expensive suitcases hitting the hardwood floor. She had turned to me with a look of absolute disgust, her lips curled into a vicious sneer. She had looked me dead in the eye and stated that Mitchell had more money than I would ever see in my entire miserable life. She had meticulously calculated her betrayal, trading 40 years of loyal marriage for the shiny illusion of limitless wealth. She had mocked my quiet discipline, dismissing the grueling hours I spent building a solid foundation for our family as a complete lack of ambition. I had let her believe she was right. I had let her walk away thinking I was a broken, stagnant man. I raised my children to understand that true power whispers, while fake wealth screams continuously for attention. Valerie had always been deaf to the whispers, completely seduced by the loudest voice in the room. Now she was standing under an arch of imported orchids, publicly praising a man who had secretly drained her retirement accounts and mortgaged her dream home just to pay for the expensive flowers she was holding. She was cementing her legacy to a hollow shell, mistaking a terminal financial disease for a crowning achievement. I watched her smile brightly for the cameras, fully realizing that her own arrogance was the exact weapon we were using to destroy her. I did not need to defend my legacy to the people sitting in these white chairs. My legacy was sitting right next to me, managing a $250 million empire while patiently waiting for the hammer to fall. The officiant finally reclaimed the microphone, clearing his throat to bring the overly theatrical ceremony to its formal conclusion. He guided them through the traditional exchange of rings. Mitchell jammed the rented cubic zirconia onto Valerie's finger with a trembling, sweaty hand, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted a marathon. Valerie slid a heavy gold band onto his finger, smiling triumphantly at the cheering crowd. The officiant asked the binding questions, and Mitchell practically shouted, "I do," before the man could even finish the sentence. Valerie offered a poised, delicate "I do," sealing her fate with absolute certainty. The officiant smiled warmly, officially pronouncing them husband and wife. The crowd of wealthy socialites erupted into polite applause and enthusiastic cheers. The string quartet immediately struck up a joyous, celebratory melody. But the true climax of the ceremony was not the ceremonial kiss. It was the absolute legal requirement that immediately followed. A small wooden table had been set up beside the floral archway, bearing the official state marriage certificate and a premium fountain pen. The officiant directed the newlyweds to the table to finalize the union. Mitchell lunged for the pen. He signed his name with frantic, aggressive strokes, legally binding himself to Valerie and her remaining assets. He handed the pen to Valerie, urging her to hurry. She took her time, signing her name with elegant, sweeping loops, smiling brightly for the photographer capturing the historic moment. The designated witnesses stepped forward and added their signatures, locking the document into absolute legal permanence. It was done. The paperwork was complete, binding, and irrevocable under state law. Valerie was now officially legally tethered to a man drowning in millions of dollars of federal tax liens, fraudulent mortgages, and predatory loans. The trap we had meticulously built over the past several weeks snapped shut with a resounding, invisible click. Mitchell let out a massive, shuddering exhale, wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead. He firmly believed he had just crossed the finish line and secured his financial salvation. He grabbed Valerie's hand, pulling her eagerly down the aisle toward the grand reception hall, desperate to hide from his vibrating phone and celebrate his fabricated victory. The newly married couple marched triumphantly toward the towering glass doors of the main estate building, leaving the cheering crowd behind in the sunlit gardens. They stepped into the cool, marble-floored foyer, ready to make their grand, arrogant entrance into the lavish reception hall. But their victorious march was abruptly and violently halted. Standing directly in front of the ornate reception doors was the estate manager, flanked tightly by two heavily built, unsmiling security guards. The manager did not offer a congratulatory smile or a polite greeting. His face was a rigid mask of cold, uncompromising fury. He stepped forward aggressively, blocking Mitchell's path and holding up a digital payment terminal. "Sir," the manager stated, his voice echoing sharply across the polished marble. "All 5 of the corporate credit cards you put on file for this event have just declined. Every single one has been flagged for severe fraud and locked by the Federal Banking Authority." Mitchell froze completely, the remaining color draining rapidly from his sweating face as Valerie gasped in sheer confusion. "We need a $200,000 wire transfer right now," the manager demanded, stepping even closer and invading Mitchell's personal space. "If the funds do not clear in the next 60 seconds, we are shutting off the lights, locking the catering hall, and calling the police for theft of services." The heavy glass doors separating the marble foyer from the grand reception hall stood slightly ajar, allowing the tense confrontation to echo directly into the opulent ballroom. The joyous string quartet music abruptly ground to a halt, replaced by the screech of a cello bow as the musicians noticed the aggressive standoff. 300 wealthy guests who had just taken their seats around the crystal-adorned tables turned their heads in absolute confusion. Mitchell yanked his phone from his tuxedo pocket with trembling hands, completely ignoring the estate manager's furious demands. He frantically opened his secure banking applications, his thumb swiping aggressively at the glass screen, desperately praying for a system glitch. The digital reality staring back at him was catastrophic. His primary checking account displayed a massive negative balance. His corporate lines of credit were flashing bright red federal lock notifications. Even his hidden offshore accounts, the ones he thought were completely untraceable, showed zero available funds. He refreshed the application 3 times, his breath hitching in his throat as the same devastating numbers remained permanently fixed on the screen. He was completely undeniably bankrupt, standing in front of a furious vendor demanding $200,000 he simply did not possess. Valerie, completely blinded by her own manufactured reality, refused to process the absolute disaster unfolding right in front of her. She stepped in front of the imposing estate manager, her designer gown rustling loudly as she jabbed a manicured finger directly at his chest. "How dare you speak to us with such an atrocious lack of respect?" Valerie screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the reception hall. "Do you have any idea who you are threatening right now? My husband is a verified billionaire. He just signed a multi-billion-dollar government contract this week. This is obviously a ridiculous banking error, and I demand you open those doors and serve my guests immediately before I buy this entire estate and fire you personally." She was fiercely defending a financial ghost. Valerie had always weaponized Mitchell's supposed wealth to elevate her own social status, using his fabricated empire as a shield against her deep-seated insecurities. She honestly believed that aligning herself with a loud, flashy man made her untouchable completely, forgetting that true wealth never has to scream at a waiter to prove its existence. While Valerie continued her hysterical tirade against the estate staff, a tall, imposing figure calmly walked past the bewildered guests and stepped directly onto the main entertainment stage. Benjamin Rosenberg, my exceptionally ruthless corporate lawyer, adjusted his tailored suit and casually approached the central microphone stand. He did not ask for permission, and he certainly did not look out of place among the elite crowd. He carried the terrifying, quiet authority of a man who held the absolute power to destroy lives with a single stack of legal documents. He signaled the audiovisual technician working the soundboard, handing him a secure digital drive. Benjamin tapped the microphone twice. The sharp rhythmic thumps cut through Valerie's screaming and instantly silenced the entire banquet hall. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," Benjamin announced, his deep, commanding voice projecting flawlessly through the massive surround sound speakers. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but there has been a slight change to the evening's scheduled programming. I am Benjamin Rosenberg, and I am here tonight legally representing Mr. Mitchell's largest private creditor." The massive, high-definition projection screens, originally set up to display a romantic slideshow of the happy couple, flickered to life. Instead of smiling engagement photos, a stark, highly detailed legal document illuminated the room in bright white light. It was the original property deed to Valerie's sprawling mansion, prominently displaying the massive $2 million commercial lien stamped heavily across the front page. Benjamin paced methodically across the stage, looking directly at the panicked groom. Mitchell did not pay for these beautiful imported orchids, the vintage champagne, or this grand estate with his own money, Benjamin explained smoothly to the captivated audience. In fact, Mr. Mitchell is currently millions of dollars in debt and the target of a massive federal fraud investigation. To secure the funds for this extravagant party, he walked into a predatory lending office yesterday afternoon and illegally mortgaged his new bride's fully paid home. Benjamin clicked a button on a remote, and the screen zoomed in closely on the bottom of the document, displaying the clearly forged signature. He also completely drained her personal retirement accounts, using fraudulent signatures to bind her legally to a crushing high-interest commercial debt. He threw his own wife directly into financial slaughter to maintain the pathetic illusion that he is a wealthy man. A collective deafening gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy guests. The high society friends who had just been toasting to Valerie's supreme success were now staring at her with wide, horrified eyes, instinctively backing away as if her sudden bankruptcy were a highly contagious disease. Valerie stopped screaming at the estate manager. Her arms slowly dropped to her side as her eyes locked onto the massive digital screens projecting the absolute destruction of her financial security. She recognized the property deed immediately. She stared at the forged signature, her mind violently connecting the pieces of the trap she had just willingly walked into by signing that marriage certificate at the altar. All the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified under the bright chandelier lights. She turned her head slowly, her breathing shallow and erratic, and looked directly at Mitchell. The man she had proudly boasted was a billionaire was currently trembling, completely speechless and unable to meet her gaze. In that agonizing, silent moment, the devastating reality finally crushed her. She was completely, undeniably broke. The devastating silence that had violently gripped the grand reception hall was suddenly broken by the sharp, cracking sound of flesh meeting flesh. Valerie swung her arm with every single ounce of her manicured strength, slapping Mitchell across his sweating face so hard that his head snapped violently to the side. The sheer force of the unexpected impact caused him to stumble backward in a blind panic. His polished designer shoes slipped awkwardly on the immaculate marble floor before he crashed heavily into a towering floral arrangement flanking the main entrance. Hundreds of rare white orchids rained down on his expensive sweat-soaked tuxedo as he cowered against the wall. "You lying, pathetic parasite," Valerie shrieked, her voice tearing through the opulent room like shattered glass. She lunged forward with blinding rage, grabbing the lapels of his ruined jacket and shaking him violently. "You stole my house. You stole my entire future." She released him with a massive shove of absolute disgust, turning frantically toward the imposing estate manager and the bewildered crowd of elite socialites. "Call my lawyers right now," Valerie screamed, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to claw her way out of the financial slaughterhouse. "I want an annulment immediately. This wedding is a complete fraud. I am not legally tied to this bankrupt criminal." She truly believed she could just erase the fresh ink on the marriage certificate and walk away completely unscathed. From the very back of the breathless reception hall, a single wooden chair scraped softly against the polished floorboards. I stood up, slowly smoothing the front of my modest navy suit. I did not rush, and I certainly did not display any of the frantic, desperate energy that was currently consuming my ex-wife. I held a single slim legal folder in my right hand, grasping it with the quiet, absolute certainty of an executioner holding a signed warrant. I began my deliberate walk down the center aisle of the magnificent ballroom. As I approached, the sea of wealthy guests automatically parted. The elite socialites who had spent the entire evening whispering cruel jokes about my faded jacket and my supposed poverty now stepped backward in stunned silence. They lowered their crystal champagne glasses and gave me a wide, highly respectful berth. They finally recognized the unmistakable aura of true, unshakable power radiating from my posture. I did not have to raise my voice or shout to command the massive room. My absolute silence was infinitely heavier and far more terrifying than Valerie's hysterical screaming. Walking toward the altar of their total destruction, my mind briefly flashed back to the day our marriage truly ended. Valerie had stood in our modest living room, sneering at my disciplined financial habits, claiming I lacked the ruthless aggression required to survive in the real world. She demanded a man who took massive risks, someone who would forcefully seize wealth rather than patiently build it. I had let her believe her own twisted philosophy. I had allowed her to weaponize my quiet patience, knowing that a fool who builds a house on stolen sand will eventually bury themselves under its weight. She wanted a ruthless businessman, and she got exactly what she asked for. I finally reached the front of the ballroom, stopping just a few feet away from where Mitchell was still cowering against the ruined floral display. Valerie spun around to face me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hope. She actually thought I was stepping forward to rescue her, to play the noble, discarded husband, rushing in to save his helpless ex-wife from a terrible mistake. She looked at the folder in my hand, desperately assuming it was some sort of legal loophole that would magically grant her the immediate annulment she was actively screaming for. I stopped directly in front of Valerie, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of icy calm. The entire banquet hall was so profoundly quiet that you could hear the faint mechanical hum of the air conditioning units above us. Valerie stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly under the heavy silk of her designer wedding gown. "Edwin," she gasped, her voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of entitlement and terror. "Tell them this is invalid. Tell them I had absolutely no idea what he was doing. I need this annulment filed immediately." I looked her dead in the eye, feeling an overwhelming, satisfying sense of closure wash over my spirit. I slowly opened the slim legal folder I had carried down the aisle. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried the lethal precision of a sniper's bullet. "There are no annulments for joint debt, Valerie," I stated smoothly, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room. "You did not just stand under that floral archway and vow to love this man. You stood in front of witnesses and signed a legally binding, state-sanctioned commercial contract. In the eyes of the federal government and every predatory lender in this city, you are now a single financial entity." Valerie's jaw trembled, her eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the legal documents resting in my hands. "You are officially his wife," I continued, closing the folder with a sharp, definitive snap. And as of 20 minutes ago, you are now legally responsible for his $4 million in high-interest predatory loans, his massive corporate deficits, and his extensive federal tax liens. You wanted a man of wealth and stature, Valerie. You got a man who just leveraged your entire remaining lifespan to pay for the cocktail shrimp your friends are holding. There is no loophole. There is no magical legal exit strategy. The mansion you bought with my divorce settlement is permanently gone. Your retirement accounts are entirely drained. You are completely and undeniably bankrupt. The sheer magnitude of my words struck her with immense physical force. Her legs buckled slightly, the heavy layers of her $50,000 wedding dress suddenly looking like a massive, suffocating shroud wrapping around her body. Mitchell remained frozen against the wall, utterly destroyed, while Valerie finally realized that her grand ascent into high society was actually a permanent plunge into absolute financial ruin. The pristine illusion of her superior life shattered entirely into a million jagged pieces. Valerie let out a guttural, agonizing wail and dropped heavily to her knees right there on the cold, polished marble floor. The heavy silk of her designer gown pooled around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably, the loud, ugly sounds of pure devastation echoing continuously through the lavish ballroom. Her wealthy friends did not step forward to comfort her. They simply watched in horrified fascination, actively distancing themselves from the toxic wreckage of her life. Desperate and completely stripped of her toxic pride, Valerie looked up through her heavily smeared makeup. Her frantic, tear-filled eyes searched the massive crowd until she found the only lifeline she thought she had left in this world. She spotted Dominic and Aaliyah standing stoically in the background, flanking Gavin with matching expressions of absolute freezing indifference. Valerie reached her trembling hands out toward our children, her voice cracking as she begged them across the silent room. "Please," she wailed, her voice thick with absolute panic. "Dominic, Aaliyah, you have to help me. Pay off his debt. Buy my house back. Please, you have to save your mother." Dominic and Aaliyah stepped forward in perfect unison, their expressions completely devoid of the panic or sympathy Valerie was desperately hoping to see. Gavin remained standing a few paces behind them, his arms crossed, watching the pathetic display with the detached interest of an auditor reviewing a failed company. Valerie raised her trembling hands, her tear-streaked face looking up at the children she had abandoned 5 years ago. She fully expected them to rush to her side to pull her up from the cold marble floor and promise that their combined incomes would shield her from Mitchell's catastrophic failures. She still believed that maternal guilt was a currency she could freely spend. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of Aaliyah's simple but elegantly tailored dress, sobbing for them to fix the massive disaster. Instead of reaching back, Aaliyah took a deliberate, measured step backward, physically removing herself from her mother's grasping hands. Dominic stood over the woman who had mercilessly mocked his ambitions just weeks prior. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He simply looked down at her with an expression of icy, impenetrable calm. Dominic adjusted his jacket, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority across the silent reception hall. "You came to my office just a few weeks ago," Dominic stated, his words measured and completely lethal. "You threw a 30-day eviction notice on my desk and called my life's work a pathetic little startup. You demanded that Dad come and beg Mitchell for a janitorial position just so I would not starve on the streets." Valerie blinked through her ruined makeup, her chest heaving as she failed to understand why her son was bringing up old insults while her entire financial world was actively burning to the ground. Dominic did not pause to let her speak. "That pathetic little startup you tried to evict us from," Dominic continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure every single wealthy guest in the room heard the absolute truth. "We initiated our initial public offering on Wall Street yesterday morning. The bell rang and our logistics software officially went public. Horizon Logistics is currently valued at $250 million. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was instantaneous. The socialites who had scoffed at my faded brown jacket were now staring at me with a sudden horrifying realization of their own monumental misjudgment. Dominic delivered the final devastating blow with surgical precision. And Dad is the absolute majority shareholder. He owns the controlling stake in a $250 million tech empire. You did not leave a broke man, Valerie. You walked away from a dynasty." The sheer gravity of those words slammed into Valerie with the force of a freight train. 5 years ago, she had justified her cruel departure by declaring that I lacked the drive to ever provide her with real wealth. She had traded my quiet, disciplined loyalty for a loud, flashy con artist who operated entirely on stolen funds. She had spent half a decade convincing herself and everyone around her that she had made the ultimate upgrade. Now, the undeniable truth was suffocating her. She had willingly abandoned a man who possessed the exact generational wealth she craved only to legally shackle herself to a bankrupt criminal who had just pawned her entire future. The irony was so profound it physically paralyzed her. She stared up at Dominic and Aaliyah, fully comprehending that her own children were executives in the very empire she had so viciously mocked. Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her breaths came in short, jagged gasps as the massive scale of her monumental mistake crashed down upon her. She looked wildly between Mitchell, who was still cowering against the ruined floral arrangement, and me, standing tall and perfectly composed in my modest navy suit. Her mind desperately scrambled for a way to reverse time to undo the binding signature she had just placed on the marriage certificate mere minutes ago. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling over the heavy silk layers of her ruined designer gown, and threw herself toward me. She reached out, trying to grab my arms, her face contorted in a mask of absolute desperation. "Edwin," she sobbed loudly, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her toxic pride. "Edwin, please. You have to listen to me. I was wrong. I was so completely wrong. He manipulated me. Mitchell lied to me about everything. He tricked me into leaving you. He brainwashed me into believing he was successful. I never wanted to hurt you. I always loved you, Edwin. Please, you have to forgive me. You have to save me from him." She was begging a multimillionaire to rescue her from the consequences of her own blinding greed. She expected that my 40 years of previous devotion would somehow override the brutal betrayal she had inflicted upon me and our children. She believed she could simply shed a few tears, play the victim of a grand manipulation, and I would instantly open my bank accounts to clear her fraudulent debts. I looked at the woman I had once promised to protect for the rest of my life. I did not feel anger, and I certainly did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt entirely liberated. I gently but firmly removed her trembling hands from my sleeves. I took a slow step back, creating a permanent physical and emotional boundary between us. I slowly shook my head, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "You were not manipulated, Valerie," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "You were perfectly awake when you made your choices. You chose the loudest man in the room because you wanted an audience. You chose the illusion of wealth over the reality of loyalty. You built this exact life. Now you have to live in it." Before Valerie could formulate another pathetic excuse, the sharp, piercing wail of heavy sirens cut violently through the quiet reception hall. The sound grew deafeningly loud, multiplied by several approaching vehicles surrounding the perimeter of the grand estate. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive stained glass windows, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the terrified wedding guests. The heavy wooden double doors at the main entrance burst open with explosive force. A tactical squad of armed federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters marched aggressively down the center aisle. They bypassed the stunned socialites and the ruined champagne towers entirely. They had been officially tipped off by the massive cache of digital evidence Gavin had secretly forwarded to the Cybercrimes Division just hours prior. The lead agent did not hesitate or ask for permission to interrupt the lavish event. He marched directly toward the floral display, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. His eyes locked onto the sweating, terrified groom who was desperately trying to shrink into the shadows of the ballroom. Mitchell's fabricated empire was officially over, and the federal government had arrived to collect the pieces. The lead federal agent did not hesitate or offer a single polite greeting. He grabbed Mitchell by the lapels of his sweat-soaked designer tuxedo and slammed him violently face down onto the nearest catered reception table. Crystal champagne flutes shattered onto the marble floor, spraying expensive vintage wine across the polished tiles. Mitchell screamed in absolute panic, thrashing against the heavy grip of the federal marshals, but he was completely overpowered. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists with a sharp, echoing snap that signaled the absolute end of his fabricated empire. The lead agent pulled Mitchell roughly to his feet, pressing him hard against the ruined table. He began reading the Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice that completely drowned out the frightened murmurs of the wealthy guests. He explicitly listed the charges, stating clearly that Mitchell was being placed under immediate federal arrest for aggravated cyber espionage, massive wire fraud, and multiple counts of corporate forgery. Mitchell blubbered incoherently, begging anyone in the room to call a lawyer. but the elite socialites he had spent years trying to impress simply turned their backs and watched his brutal downfall in utter silence. Mitchell was dragged aggressively out the main doors by the armed federal agents, leaving a suffocating, terrifying vacuum in the grand reception hall. Valerie remained exactly where she had fallen, collapsed on the cold marble floor in a pool of heavy white silk. Her $50,000 custom designer wedding gown was now stained with spilled champagne and crushed imported orchids. The high society friends she had meticulously invited to witness her ultimate ascension into the elite class were already fleeing the venue. They grabbed their expensive coats and hurried toward the valet circle, desperate to completely erase their association with a federally indicted fraudster. Not a single person offered her a hand. She was utterly alone, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of her own blinding greed. Then the true financial nightmare finally arrived to collect its due. 3 imposing men wearing cheap dark suits walked through the open double doors, bypassing the panicked estate staff. They were the aggressive collection agents from Apex Capital Solutions, the predatory lending firm Mitchell had used to secure his final desperate $500,000 loan. Because our corporate conglomerate secretly owned Apex, we had strategically allowed the loan to process, placing Valerie's forged collateral directly on the active collection ledger. The lead agent marched straight up to Valerie, looming over her trembling form. He did not care that she was wearing a wedding dress or that she was crying hysterically. He tossed a heavy legal clipboard directly onto the floor beside her. He coldly informed her that since her husband was currently in federal custody and their corporate assets were frozen, she was now the sole active guarantor of the massive debt. He stated that they were officially seizing the sprawling mansion she had purchased with my divorce settlement 5 years ago. He demanded she hand over the keys and prepare for immediate asset liquidation. Valerie screamed, begging them to show mercy, pleading that she was just a victim who had no idea what her husband was doing behind closed doors. The agent simply smiled a cold, ruthless smile, informing her that they were fully prepared to discuss extremely aggressive repayment plans for the next 20 years of her life. I did not stay to watch the collection agents dismantle the remaining fragments of Valerie's ruined life. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. Justice had not just been served. It had been executed with absolute mathematical precision. I turned my back on the chaotic screaming spectacle inside the grand ballroom and began walking toward the exit. Dominic, Aaliyah, and Gavin fell perfectly into step right beside me. We walked shoulder to shoulder out of the suffocating opulent estate and stepped into the crisp, quiet evening air. The transition from the screaming panic of the reception hall to the serene silence of the parking lot felt like stepping out of a raging hurricane into a calm, sunlit room. We bypassed the frantic line of wealthy guests fighting over the valet service. We walked straight to my reliable old sedan, parked quietly near the back of the lot. I unlocked the doors and we all climbed inside the modest vehicle. Dominic sat in the passenger seat, loosening his tie with a deep, genuine sigh of relief. Aaliyah and Gavin sat in the back, their hands linked tightly together. I started the engine, the familiar steady hum of the motor providing a comforting soundtrack to our absolute victory. I drove us far away from the elite country clubs and the fake billionaires, steering the car toward the quiet, working-class neighborhood where we had started our journey. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of our favorite local 24-hour diner. It was a simple place with vinyl booths, neon signs, and the smell of roasted coffee beans and fried food. We walked in and took our usual corner booth, ordering a massive round of greasy cheeseburgers, heavily salted French fries, and steaming mugs of strong black coffee. When the waitress brought our food, Dominic looked at his phone, reading a headline about the federal raid, and let out a loud, booming laugh. Aaliyah joined in, leaning her head on Gavin's shoulder, her laughter echoing warmly across the small diner. I sat back in the vinyl booth watching my children smile with genuine, unburdened joy. We were not celebrating the destruction of others. We were celebrating the absolute, unshakable security of our own family. I picked up my heavy ceramic mug, taking a slow, satisfying sip of the bitter black coffee. I turned my head away from the joyful noise of my children and looked quietly out the large glass window of the diner. The streetlights cast long, steady shadows across the empty pavement, illuminating a world that felt incredibly peaceful. My mind drifted back to that rainy morning half a decade ago, standing in the entryway of my house watching my wife pack her bags to leave me for my closest friend. I smiled a small, deeply contented smile against the rim of my coffee cup. Valerie was absolutely right 5 years ago. Mitchell does have more than me. He has 15 years ahead of him in a maximum security federal prison and a towering mountain of unpayable, crushing debt that will haunt him until his dying breath. And me. I looked back at the table watching Dominic pass the ketchup to Aaliyah while Gavin cracked a terrible joke. I have my absolute peace of mind. A multi-million-dollar legacy built on honest discipline and a true family that no amount of money could ever possibly buy. Looking back at the chaotic wreckage of Valerie and Mitchell's lives, there is one more profound lesson that stands above the rest. True power never requires an audience. We live in a world that constantly demands loud validation. People are obsessed with broadcasting every minor victory, desperately seeking the approval of strangers to validate their own self-worth. They equate visibility with success, firmly believing that if no one sees their wealth, it somehow does not exist. But the exact opposite is actually true. The loudest people in the room are almost always the most incredibly vulnerable and deeply insecure. Valerie and Mitchell were completely consumed by this dangerous illusion. Their entire relationship was not built on genuine love or mutual respect. It was built entirely on a shared, pathetic need to be admired by people they did not even genuinely like. Mitchell stole money and destroyed his future simply because he could not stomach the idea of looking like a failure in front of high society. Valerie sacrificed 40 years of unwavering loyalty just to wear a rented diamond and host a lavish party. They spent every waking moment trying to convince the outside world that they were absolute royalty. They were totally trapped in a vicious cycle of performative success, constantly prioritizing expensive aesthetics over actual financial stability. Their desperate need for public applause became the exact heavy anchor that dragged them down to the dark bottom of the deep ocean. In stark contrast, my children and I chose the path of total silence. We built a $250 million enterprise inside a dusty brick building, because we understood that real wealth does not require a shiny facade. When you operate quietly, you eliminate external pressure. You stop making emotional business decisions based on what other people might think. We did not buy luxury cars or designer suits because those things only attract predators and create unnecessary liabilities. We invested our capital into brilliant technology, unbreakable family loyalty, and impenetrable security. By remaining completely invisible, we became utterly invincible. Mitchell walked right into our traps because his loud ego blinded him to the quiet danger we presented. He assumed we were weak because we did not brag. But silence is the absolute ultimate luxury. It buys you the freedom to observe your enemies, calculate your moves, and execute your plans with surgical precision. If you take anything away from this story, let it be the profound value of building your life in the shadows. Do not let the modern obsession with public validation rush your personal growth or dictate your financial habits. Let the arrogant people mock your faded jackets and your simple lifestyle. Let them laugh at your modest vehicles and your quiet demeanor. Their laughter is entirely irrelevant when you hold the keys to a kingdom they cannot even see. When you stop worrying about looking successful, you can finally focus all your energy on actually being successful. True security is knowing you have the absolute power to protect your loved ones and dictate your own destiny without needing anyone else to applaud you for it. Keep your circle small, keep your plans completely hidden, and let your ultimate results speak for themselves when the time is right. If you have ever chosen quiet progress over loud bragging, or if you have successfully removed toxic people from your own journey, please share your amazing experience in the comments section below. Let me know where you are watching from today. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and always remember to protect your peace.